It is the year 180, and along the cold, fog-wrapped banks of the Danube, the most powerful man in the world cannot sleep. Marcus Aurelius, Emperor of Rome, stoic philosopher and deeply reluctant general, lies awake in a campaign tent while somewhere out in the darkness the long Marcomannic wars grind on without mercy. His chest aches, his stomach has troubled him for years, and so, as he does nearly every day of his later life, he reaches in the dark for a small measure of a honeyed medicine called theriac, a thick and bitter paste of some 64 ingredients, and folded quietly among them, a dose of opium. His personal physician mixes it for him, a brilliant, tireless, and famously self-satisfied Greek named Galen. Galen tells us plainly that he adjusted the recipe as the years went on, cutting the opium, back when the emperor grew too drowsy to hold court, and adding it again when the pain and the sleeplessness came creeping back. The historian Cassius Dio records that the emperor leaned on the drug so heavily that he could barely face the day without it. Sit with that for a moment. The empire that gave us roads, aqueducts and law was governed for a while by a gentle insomniac quietly dependent on the dried tears of a flower. And here is the strange part, the part that makes tonight's journey worth taking. Nobody in Rome found this scandalous. Opium was not hidden in a back alley. It was sold openly in the markets, pressed into little cakes, folded into wine, prescribed by respectable doctors, and stamped onto coins beside the goddess of harvest. The ancient world swam in substances we would now shelve behind a pharmacist's counter, or lock away entirely, and it did so with an easy, matter-of-fact shrug that can be genuinely startling to a modern ear. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. No pressure, no hard sell. If gentle histories whispered into the dark are your idea of a good night, then you and I are going to get along beautifully over the next couple of hours. And while you are settling in, I would love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. It genuinely delights me to imagine this quiet little audience scattered across the planet. Some of you at midnight, some of you on a grey afternoon, some of you pretending to work, all of us wandering back 2,000 years together. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let us ease into tonight's journey together. There is no rush at all. We have all the time in the world, and the world we are visiting has been patiently waiting for a very, very long time. Picture yourself, then, stepping out of your own comfortable century and into a warmer, dustier, more fragrant age. The air smells of wood smoke and crushed herbs, of wine and river mud, and the faint sweetness of flowers you cannot quite name. You are no longer a passive reader. You are a traveller now, moving through the ports and temples and dinner parties of Greece and Rome, and everywhere you go you will find people reaching for something to ease pain, to summon sleep, to speak with their gods, or simply to make a long evening glow a little brighter. You should understand something before we go any further, because it will shape everything. You see tonight, the Greeks had a single slippery word for all of this. The word was pharmakon, and a pharmakon could be a medicine, or a poison, or a magic charm, all at once, depending entirely on the dose, the intent, and a good measure of luck. The very same plant that soothed a dying man could kill a healthy one. The line between healing and harm was not a wall, it was a doorway, and everyone walked through it. You will meet doctors tonight who wrote careful, sober textbooks about these plants. Textbooks. So good they were copied and trusted for 1,500 years. You will meet an emperor's poisoner who was rewarded with country estates. You will meet priestesses who breathed strange vapours rising from the rock and spoke, they believed, with the voice of a god. And yes, historians still argue whether these people were reckless, wise, desperate, or simply doing their honest best in a world with no anaesthetic, no clean surgery, and no gentle way to say goodnight to pain. Here already is your first quiet fact to tuck under your pillow. The oldest physical trace of the opium poppy in Europe comes not from some later, more decadent age, but from a cave near Lake Bracciano in Italy, where preserved poppy seeds were found buried under 3 meters of stony deposit, some 7,500 years old. Long before there was a Rome to rule, before there were emperors or philosophers or armies on the Danube, people in Italy were already tending this small, papery flower and, it seems, valuing it for something. And here is your quirky little tidbit, the sort of thing you can mention at a dinner party if you want people to slowly edge away from you. The Romans so associated the poppy with sleep and gentle death that they carved it onto tombstones, a soft promise that the sleeper below had finally, blessedly, been released from a lifetime of pain, a flower for the grave and a flower for the cradle, and the very same flower in the Emperor's cup. That is the ancient world in a single bloom. So breathe out, let your shoulders drop and let the centuries fall away. Our poppy has a long story to tell, and we are only just beginning to follow it. To understand why a single flower could hold such power over the imagination of two civilizations, you have to picture where it grew. In the ancient Mediterranean, the poppy did not hide in some secret garden. It grew in the grain fields, tall and papery among the ripening barley, and wheat, its 4 crumpled petals a startling splash of scarlet against the gold. And because it grew alongside the grain, the Greeks tied it, almost inevitably, to Demeter, the great goddess of the harvest, the mother of all growing things. Her Roman counterpart, Ceres, is why we still say the word cereal every time we pour breakfast into a bowl. You can imagine how the connection formed. Here is the goddess who makes the fields ripen, and here, blooming right in the middle of her golden gift, is a flower whose milky sap can dull the sharpest grief and pull a suffering person down into deep, painless sleep. To an ancient mind, that was not a coincidence. That was a message. The same divine hand that fed you could also, when you had suffered enough, gently switch off the pain and let you rest. Grain for the body, poppy for the soul, both from the same generous, slightly unsettling goddess. And the Greeks leaned into this with real enthusiasm. Statues and poems gave the poppy to their gentlest deities. Hypnos, the god of sleep, and his darker twin brother Thanatos, the quiet god of death, were shown drowsing among poppy blooms. Their Roman cousin Somnus carried them too, and later poets handed a fistful to Morpheus, the god of dreams, whose name you still meet whenever someone drifts off into the arms of Morpheus. It is a lovely bit of branding, really. If sleep and dreams and death all get the same flower, someone in antiquity had clearly noticed exactly what that flower could do. Here is your genuine, well-attested fact for this stretch of the journey, and it is hiding in plain sight in the plant's own name. The botanical species is Papaver somniferum, and that second word, somniferum, is simply Latin for sleep-bringing. When later scholars formally named the opium poppy, they did not reach for anything clever or obscure. They just wrote down, in the plainest possible Latin, the one thing everyone had known about it since before Rome had walls. This is the flower that brings sleep. Case closed. No further questions. The great botanist Theophrastus, who took over Aristotle's school in Athens and who was often called the father of botany, wrote about the juice of the poppy in his careful surveys of the plant world around the end of the 4th century before the Common Era. He described how the sap was collected and how it was used, treating it not as some exotic marvel but as one more useful plant among hundreds, filed neatly between the herbs that cured coughs and the roots that settled stomachs. That casual tone tells you everything. To an educated Greek, the poppy was simply part of the furniture of the natural world. Now, a small confession, and here is where the honest historian has to raise a hand. Historians still argue whether every ancient poppy in myth and art was actually the opium poppy, the sleep-bringing one, or whether some of those scarlet blooms were just the common red corn poppy, the cheerful weed that colours European fields to this day and has almost no narcotic punch at all. The two look broadly similar from a distance, especially if you're a sculptor working in marble rather than a botanist with a magnifying glass. So when you see a poppy on an old coin, you cannot always be certain whether it promised sleep or simply pretty decoration. The ancients, frustratingly, did not label their flowers for our convenience. But the confusion itself is telling, because whether or not every carved poppy was the real narcotic article, the flower had clearly gathered a reputation potent enough to make it worth carving in the first place. You do not put a random weed in the hand of the god of sleep. You put the flower that everybody already associates with drifting off. The symbolism only works because the pharmacology was common knowledge, and it was common knowledge in the most literal way. This was not secret temple lore guarded by hooded priests. A farmer knew it. A midwife knew it. The woman selling herbs from a blanket in the market knew it, and would happily tell you for a coin exactly how much to give a screaming infant to make it finally, mercifully sleep, which, spoiler, was sometimes rather too much. We will come back to that uncomfortable little detail later, because the ancients used opium on children with a breeziness that should make every modern parent go slightly pale. For now, though, just hold the image, a field of gold in the Mediterranean sun, scatter of red poppies nodding in the warm wind, bees moving lazily from bloom to bloom, entirely unbothered by the philosophy of it all. And walking through that field, an ordinary person who understands, without any need for a chemistry lesson, that the flower brushing against their knee holds both comfort and danger in the very same drop of milky sap. That is the quiet genius of the poppy, and the reason our journey begins here. It is beautiful, and it is fragile, and it is dangerous, and the ancient world adored it for all three qualities at once. The Greeks and Romans did not see a contradiction in that. They saw a gift and a warning growing on the very same stem, in the very same field, blessed by the very same goddess who put bread on the table. So let the golden field blur softly at the edges now, and let us follow that milky sap out of the flower and into the careful, patient hands of the people who learn to collect it. Collecting opium is slow, patient, slightly meditative work, and the method the ancients used is so effective that, astonishingly, it has barely changed in 2,000 years. Picture yourself crouched in that poppy field in the cool of early morning, a small curved blade in your hand. In front of you stands the seed pod, the swollen green capsule left behind once the scarlet petals have dropped away. It is fat, smooth, and faintly waxy, about the size of a large marble, and inside it a milky fluid is waiting. You do not cut the pod open. That would be a beginner's mistake, and the plant would simply weep its treasure into the dirt. Instead, you score it, drawing your blade in a series of shallow, careful lines across the skin of the capsule, just deep enough to wound it without slicing through. And then, because nature is in no hurry, you wait. Overnight, from each shallow cut, a white latex slowly seeps and beads and thickens in the air, turning gummy and brown as the hours pass. In the morning you return and scrape off the sticky residue, dark and bitter, and that, when it is dried and pressed, is opium. The Greek physician Dioscorides, whom you will get to know very well tonight, described this exact process in the 1st century of the Common Era, and any modern farmer harvesting opium legally for the pharmaceutical trade would recognize every step. The scoring, the overnight seep, the morning scrape. 2 millennia of medicine, painkillers, and no small amount of misery, all flowing from a technique that a Roman-era doctor could have taught you in an afternoon. There is something humbling in that. We have split the atom and mapped the genome, and we still get our morphine essentially the way Dioscorides did. Now, the ancients were fussy about their terminology, and it is worth knowing. The difference, if only so you can nod wisely the next time it comes up, which, let us be honest, will be never. The pure juice scraped from the scored pod they called opium, from which we get our word opium. But there was also a weaker, cruder preparation made by crushing and boiling the whole. Plant, leaves, and pods together, and squeezing out the liquid. This second, gentler version they called meconium. The good doctors were quite clear that opium was the strong stuff, and meconium the diluted. Cousin, which is the ancient equivalent of knowing the difference between a double espresso and a cup left too long by the window. Here is your solid fact for this leg of the trip. Once collected and dried, opium was worked into a portable, sellable form, and Pliny the Elder tells us it was kneaded and shaped, sometimes into small lozenges or little cakes. Ready for the market stall, it travelled. The city of Ephesus, on the coast of what is now Turkey, became particularly associated with the poppy. Trade and opium moved along the same busy sea lanes that carried wine, oil, and grain across the whole Mediterranean world. This was not a fringe substance smuggled in the dark. It was cargo, weighed and priced and taxed like any other, and where there is a valuable commodity there is inevitably someone cutting corners. Here is your quirky tidbit. Pliny, who had strong opinions about absolutely everything, complained that dishonest sellers adulterated their opium, bulking it out with other gummy substances to stretch the profit. So yes, 2,000 years ago, somewhere in a Roman market, a shady trader was watering down the merchandise, and a grumpy Roman naturalist was writing an angry review about it. Some things about human commerce are simply eternal. You could practically leave him a 1-star notice on the stall. Historians still argue whether the opium of the ancient world was actually potent enough to produce the dramatic, dreamy highs that later writers, and rather a lot of excitable modern documentaries, love to imagine. Ancient poppy strains may have been weaker than modern cultivated ones. The preparations were inconsistent from batch to batch, and a lozenge bought in one town might be twice the strength of one bought in the next. Some scholars think most ancient opium use was fairly mild, aimed squarely at pain and sleep rather than transcendent visions. Others suspect that with enough of it, and the ancients certainly had enough. Of it, the effects could be every bit as powerful as anything that came later. The truth is probably that it varied wildly, which is a deeply unsatisfying answer, but history rarely tidies itself up for our comfort. What is not in doubt is how ordinary the whole business was. You could walk into a market, hand over your coins, and walk out with a small, dark lozenge that would ease your aching tooth, quiet your cough, calm your churning gut, or carry you off into a heavy, dreamless sleep. No prescription. No pharmacist frowning over your paperwork. No lecture, just a transaction as simple as buying a loaf of bread from a seller who might, if the price was right, also throw in a little advice on the dose. That casualness is the thread to hold on to as we go deeper. The ancient relationship with these substances was not our relationship. There were no strict legal categories, no war on drugs, no sharp line between medicine and vice. There was only the pharmakon, that slippery word again, and the quiet universal understanding that the same little brown lozenge could be your salvation or your undoing, depending entirely on how much of it you were foolish enough to swallow. So picture the market stall fading behind you now, the smell of dust and herbs and sun-warmed stone, the murmur of haggling voices. Tuck your little lozenge away, unwrapped and unregulated, and let us drift back even further, past the doctors and the traders, all the way to the very oldest stories the Greeks ever told, where drugs first appear not in a pharmacy but in poetry. Long before Greece had doctors writing careful textbooks, it had poets, and the very oldest Greek poetry is already soaked in drugs. Open the Odyssey, that great wandering epic attributed to Homer, and you will find one of the earliest and loveliest descriptions of a mood-altering substance anywhere in Western literature. It happens at a dinner party, of course, because where else would it happen? The scene is the palace of Menelaus in Sparta. The guests have fallen into gloom, remembering absent friends and the long griefs of the Trojan War, and the evening is curdling into misery. So Helen, the same Helen whose face supposedly launched 1,000 ships, quietly does something remarkable. She slips a drug into the wine bowl. Homer calls it nepenthe, which means, quite literally, the banisher of sorrow. A drug so powerful, the poet says, that whoever drinks it will feel no grief for a whole day, not even if their own mother and father were to die, not even if they watched a brother or a beloved son cut down before their eyes. And here is the detail I adore. Homer tells us exactly where Helen got it. It came from Egypt, given to her by a woman named Polydamna, the wife of a man called Thon, in a land where, the poet says admiringly, the fertile earth grows more drugs than anywhere else, and every man is a skilled physician. Sit with that for a second. In the foundational literature of Greece, the wonder drug is a foreign import, specifically Egyptian, handed woman to woman, and it works by switching off human sorrow the way you might snuff a lamp. The Greeks looked south to Egypt and saw a nation of pharmacists, a place of ancient and slightly intimidating chemical wisdom. And you know what? They were not entirely wrong. Egypt really was a centre of the ancient drug and medicine trade, and Egyptian medical papyri list poppy and dozens of other plant remedies with brisk professional confidence. Historians still argue whether nepenthe was meant to be a real, identifiable substance or simply a poetic fantasy. Some say it was opium, the sorrow-dulling poppy we have been following, dissolved into wine, exactly as later Greeks and Romans really did dose their drinks. Others suggest cannabis, or some blend of herbs, or a memory of Egyptian funeral practice. And a good number of scholars throw up their hands and say it was never meant to be pinned down at all, that Homer was painting a dream, not writing a recipe. We will never know, and that uncertainty is somehow perfect, because it means the very first drug in Greek literature is one nobody can quite identify. The banisher of sorrow keeps its own secrets, but nepenthe is not the only chemical marvel wandering through the Odyssey. Sail a little further with our hero Odysseus and you reach the land of the lotus eaters, a gentle, dangerous people who live on the fruit of the lotus. When some of Odysseus's crew taste it, they are undone, not by violence but by contentment. They lose all desire to go home. They just want to stay, chewing the sweet fruit, forgetting their families, their ship, their entire lives, drifting in a warm haze of not caring. Odysseus has to drag them back to the boats by force, weeping, and lash them under the benches. It is, when you think about it, one of the earliest and most vivid descriptions of the way a pleasant substance can quietly steal a person's ambition and leave a happy, hollow calm in its place. Homer understood something about the seductive danger of feeling too good. And then, most famous of all, there is Circe, the enchantress on her island, who welcomes Odysseus's men into her hall and serves them a kindly-seeming meal. But she has mixed her food and wine with wicked drugs, and the moment the men eat, she taps them with her wand and turns them into pigs, grunting and bristling in her steer, though cruelly, keeping their human minds intact so they know exactly what has happened. Odysseus only escapes because the god Hermes gives him a magic herb called moly, a mysterious plant with a black root and a milk-white flower, which makes him immune to her potions. The very first antidote in Western literature, handed over by a god, so that a hero could outdrug a witch. Here is your quirky little tidbit to carry off to sleep. Botanists and classicists have spent a genuinely absurd amount of energy trying to work out what moly actually was, this fictional counter-drug from a 3,000-year-old poem. The leading modern candidate is the snowdrop, an innocent little spring flower which, it turns out, contains a compound that really can counter certain kinds of poisoning that cause hallucinations and confusion. So a magic herb invented for a myth may have accidentally described a real pharmacological effect, which is either a delightful coincidence or evidence that Homer knew more than he was letting on. Take your pick, it is late, and either answer is charming. What all these stories share is a single revealing instinct. To the earliest Greeks, drugs were powerful, foreign, and morally slippery. They could comfort you or trap you, heal you or transform you into livestock, and the difference lay entirely in who was mixing the bowl and why. That word again, pharmakon, sits underneath all of it, refusing to choose between medicine and poison. Helen's kindly cup and Circe's wicked one are, chemically speaking, cousins. So the poets got there first, long before the physicians, and they framed the entire conversation the Greeks and Romans would go on having for the next 1,000 years. Drugs as gift. Drugs as danger. Drugs as the thing that happens again and again at dinner in the wine. Which is convenient because dinner and wine are exactly where we are heading next, out of the misty world of myth and into the very real, very loud, very drunken reality of the ancient drinking party. If opium was the medicine of the ancient world, wine was its water, its comfort, its ritual, and its most cheerfully abused drug of all. Wine was everywhere. It was drunk by rich and poor, by soldiers and senators, by philosophers and farmhands, by children in watered form and by gods in myth. To be a Greek or a Roman was in large part to be a person with a cup of wine somewhere near your hand. And the astonishing thing, the thing that would horrify a modern sommelier, is that almost nobody drank it the way we do. You did not, if you were a civilized person, drink your wine neat. To pour undiluted wine straight down your throat was considered the mark of a barbarian, a savage, a person with no self-control and probably no table manners either. Civilized people mixed their wine with water, and not a shy splash of water either. The usual ratios were generous, sometimes 1 part wine to 2 parts water, sometimes 1 to 3, occasionally even weaker. The ancients looked at a full-strength cup the way you might look at someone drinking neat spirits at breakfast, with a raised eyebrow and a quiet judgment. At the heart of the Greek drinking party, the symposium, stood a large, beautiful mixing bowl called the crater. This was the social and literal centre of the evening. Into the crater went the wine and the water, blended to an agreed strength, and from the crater the cups of all the guests were filled. It was communal by design. Everyone at the party drank from the same shared brew at the same shared strength, which meant the whole room rose and fell together on the same gentle tide of intoxication. There was something almost democratic about it, a shared voyage rather than a private indulgence. Here is your reliable fact for tonight. The word symposium itself tells you what these gatherings were really for. It comes from Greek roots meaning, roughly, drinking together. Not eating together, not debating together, but drinking together. The food came first, at a separate stage of the evening, and then the tables were cleared, garlands were handed out, a libation was poured to the gods, and the real business began, which was reclining on couches, drinking watered wine and talking. And oh, how they talked. Some of the most celebrated works of Greek philosophy are set at exactly these parties. Plato wrote an entire dialogue called the Symposium, in which a roomful of Athenians drinking through the night take turns making speeches about the nature of love. It is one of the great texts of Western thought, and it is technically a record of a very classy drinks evening. Now, the couches deserve a word because they are wonderfully particular. You did not sit at a symposium. You reclined. Guests lay propped on their left elbows on cushioned couches arranged around the room, drinking and eating in a sort of permanent, elegant lounge. To a modern eye, it looks impossibly decadent. A room full of adults lying down to drink, and honestly, once you have pictured it, the standard dinner party starts to feel like a missed opportunity. Why have we all agreed to sit upright? The Greeks knew something we have forgotten. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is a slightly awkward one. These classical Greek symposia were, as a rule, gatherings for men. Respectable wives stayed home. The women present at a symposium were more often entertainers, musicians, dancers, and companions hired for the evening. So the great philosophical drinking parties we admire so much were, socially speaking, closer to an exclusive gentleman's club than to a modern mixed dinner, a detail that tends to get quietly skipped in the more romantic retellings. The Romans, as we will see, changed this, and their banquets welcomed respectable women to the couches, which is one small point in Rome's favour on the manners scoreboard. Historians still argue whether all that dilution means the ancients were actually drinking something quite weak, or whether the sheer volume made up for it. Think about it. If your wine is cut 2-to-1 with water, but you spend an entire night steadily refilling your cup from the crater, hour after hour, speech after speech, you can still end an evening thoroughly, comprehensively drunk. Some scholars picture the symposium as a mild, sophisticated affair. Others point to the ancient sources themselves, which are absolutely full of hangovers, brawls, smashed furniture, and men staggering home through the streets with torches singing badly. The truth, once again, probably depended entirely on the night, the company, and how strict the person in charge of the bowl decided to be, because there was always a person in charge of the bowl. The symposium was not a free-for-all where you helped yourself. That would have been chaos, and the Greeks, for all their love of a good drink, were oddly organised about their disorder. Every proper drinking party had a master of ceremonies, a referee of intoxication, whose entire job was to decide how strong the wine would be, how fast it would flow, and when, if ever, to make it stronger. He set the rhythm of the whole evening. He could keep things philosophical and restrained, or he could, with a nod, tip the room toward glorious ruin. That figure, the master of the drinking, is where we are heading next, because the ancients had turned the simple act of getting drunk into something with rules, stages, and a startlingly clear-eyed understanding of exactly how a night of wine tends to unfold. They knew, with almost scientific precision, how many bowls it took to go from pleasant conversation to regrettable decisions, and they wrote it down. So settle deeper into your cushions, imagine the lamplight glowing warm on the painted walls, the murmur of voices, the splash of wine into water, and let us meet the man whose solemn duty it was to keep an entire room of philosophers from making complete fools of themselves. Spoiler, he often failed. The master of the Greek drinking party was called the symposiarch, which translates to something like ruler of the symposium, and it was both an honour and a genuine responsibility. He was chosen at the start of the evening, sometimes by a roll of the dice, and once appointed his word was law. He decided the crucial ratio of wine to water in the great mixing bowl, and by controlling that single number he controlled the destiny of the entire night. Weak mix, and the party stayed thoughtful and calm. Strong mix, and well, the furniture took its chances. The symposiarch set the pace of the toasts, chose the topics of conversation, and could impose playful penalties on anyone who broke the rules, such as making a guest drink a cup down in one, or sing, or dance, or answer a riddle. He was part host, part referee, and part mischievous god of the evening, holding the mood of a dozen drunk philosophers in the palm of his hand. It was a role that demanded a cool head, which is a little ironic given that he was, of course, drinking the whole time as well. Regulating everyone else's intoxication while managing your own is a delicate art, rather like being the only soberish person trying to organise a game at a family gathering. Good luck to him. Now here is where the ancients get genuinely wonderful, and here is your fact to treasure. A Greek comic playwright named Eubulus, writing in the 4th century before the Common Era, gave us a famous speech in which the god of wine himself, Dionysus, lays out exactly how a night of drinking should go, bowl by bowl. It is one of the most quoted passages about drinking in all of antiquity, and it is startlingly accurate. Dionysus explains that for sensible people he mixes only 3 bowls. The first bowl, he says, is for health. The second is for love and pleasure. The third is for sleep, and when that one is drunk, wise guests go home. The 4th bowl, the god warns, is no longer ours. it belongs to bad behaviour. The 5th leads to shouting, the 6th to drunken revelry, the 7th to black eyes. The 8th brings the police, or rather its ancient equivalent. The 9th belongs to misery, and the 10th to madness and throwing the furniture around. Read that list again and marvel, because a comic poet 2,500 years ago mapped the exact emotional arc of a heavy night out, with a precision that no modern public health poster has ever improved, upon health, romance, sleepiness, then the slow, predictable slide through loudness, aggression, regret, and finally the hurling of household objects. If you have ever been to a wedding, you have witnessed the full, Eubulus sequence play out in real time. The ancients had our number completely. The lovely thing is that this was understood as wisdom, not as a joke, or rather, as both at once. The point of the 3-bowl rule was self-knowledge. A cultured person was supposed to know where the pleasant middle of the evening ended and the regrettable slope began, and to have the discipline to stop at bowl 3 when sleep was calling and dignity was still intact. The symposiarch existed partly to help everyone honour that wisdom, and partly on a wilder night to gleefully ignore it. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is a good one for your own next gathering. The Greeks played a drinking game at these parties called kotobos, which was essentially competitive wine flinging. Guests would leave a little wine in the bottom of their broad, shallow cups and then flick the dregs across the room, trying to hit a target, often a small disc balanced on a stand, or to sink little floating dishes in a basin of water. There was technique involved, a particular twist of the wrist, and skilled players were admired. Prizes were given, so the sophisticated intellectual heirs of Socrates spent their evenings hurling the backwash of their wine across the room at a target for points. Every civilization, no matter how refined, eventually invents a way to throw things while drunk. It appears to be a human constant. Historians still argue whether the 3-bowl ideal was ever actually followed, or whether it was, like most good advice about moderation, mainly admired and rarely obeyed. The literature is full of parties that clearly rocketed straight past bowl 3 and kept going, and moralists were forever complaining about young men who drank themselves stupid. The ideal existed. Whether anyone lived up to it on a good night is frankly doubtful, and the very fact that the poets kept repeating the warning suggests that people needed constant reminding. You do not lecture people about stopping at 3 unless they have a strong and reliable habit of not stopping at 3. And so the symposium became a kind of controlled experiment in human weakness, staged night after night across the Greek world. The rules were clear. The wisdom was ancient. The mixing bowl sat there in the middle of the room, glinting in the lamplight, and everyone knew exactly how the evening was supposed to go. And then the wine flowed, and the toasts multiplied, and somewhere around the 4th or 5th bowl the careful architecture of moderation quietly collapsed, as it always had, as it always would. There is something deeply comforting in that, I think, as you lie there in the dark. These people, so distant, so foreign in their togas and their reclining couches, were exactly like us, in the way they drank and joked and overdid it, and swore the next morning that 3 bowls really would have been plenty. Human beings have been making that same resolution, and breaking it, for well over 2,000 years. Now let us cross the sea from Greece to Rome, where the drinking party got a new name, a new set of rules, and gloriously a new level of excess. When the Romans inherited the Greek drinking culture, they did what the Romans always did with a good Greek idea. They kept the essentials, gave everything Latin names, and then quietly made it bigger, richer, and more complicated. The Roman version of the drinking party was called the commissatio, and it followed. The great Roman evening meal, the cena, which was itself the centrepiece of a proper Roman social occasion, known broadly as the convivium, a word that simply means living together. That is a rather beautiful way to describe dinner when you think about it. Not merely eating together, but living together for an evening. The Romans, like the Greeks, mixed their wine with water and regarded drinking it straight as the sort of thing done by barbarians and other people they preferred to conquer. But they added a very Roman refinement, where the Greeks blended their wine cold in the communal crater. Wealthy Romans developed a taste for warm wine, and to serve it they used an ingenious device called an orthepsa, a kind of elegant metal urn with a chamber for hot coals that could heat water on the spot. Picture a fancy bronze samovar sitting on the table gently steaming, ready to mix a warm cup on a cold evening. The Romans, bless them, had invented the mulled wine dispenser roughly 2,000 years before your local winter market, and the Romans made one genuinely admirable change to the guest list. Where the classic Greek symposium was a men-only affair, the Roman convivium welcomed respectable women to recline at the table alongside the men. Roman dinner society was, in this one respect, a good deal less stuffy than its Greek model. Husbands and wives dined together, conversation flowed across the couches, and the whole occasion had a warmer, more domestic, more genuinely social flavour. So if you had to be transported back to an ancient dinner party tonight, you would, on balance, probably have a nicer time in Rome. Better heating, mixed company, and as we'll see, a truly spectacular commitment to showing off. The Romans kept the Greek idea of a master of ceremonies too, and gave him the splendid title of Magister Bibendi, the master of drinking. Just like the symposiarch, he set the strength of the wine and the order of the toasts, ruling over the second, boozier half of the evening. And Roman toasting could become an endurance sport. There was a custom of drinking a cup for each letter in the name of the person you were honouring. So toasting a friend with a short name was a mercy, and toasting one with a long name was a genuine threat to your evening. Imagine raising a full cup for every letter of somebody's name, and you will understand why Roman moralists spent so much ink complaining about drunkenness. Some poor guest was always being made to toast a man called something enormous, letter by agonising letter, while the Magister Bibendi grinned. Here is your reliable fact. The Romans were passionate connoisseurs of wine, and the most celebrated of all Roman wines was Falernian, produced from vineyards on the slopes of Mount Falernus in Campania, in the south of Italy. Falernian was the prestige wine, the one poets praised and hosts boasted about, prized especially when it had been aged for years, even decades, until it turned amber and strong. A truly old vintage of Falernian was the sort of thing a rich Roman would produce to make his guests gasp and his rivals seethe. It was the ancient world's grand cru, the bottle you brought out to announce, without saying a word, exactly how important you were. And this points to your quirky tidbit, which is that Roman dining was, at the top of society, a ferocious contest of one-upmanship dressed up as hospitality. The satirists of Rome, writers like Petronius and Juvenal, have left us gleeful, savage descriptions of vulgar hosts serving absurd, showy dishes, and sometimes cruelly, giving their more important guests better wine than the lesser ones seated further down the table. Imagine attending a dinner where you could physically taste your own social ranking in the quality of the cup you were handed. Nothing says warm hospitality quite like a host publicly grading his friends by vintage. The Roman elite turned dinner into a blood sport, and the weapon was wine. Historians still argue whether the wild excesses described by these Roman satirists were accurate reporting or comic exaggeration. Writers like Petronius, whose famous banquet of the vulgar millionaire Trimalchio is one of the funniest things to survive from antiquity, were satirists, and satire always turns the volume up. Did any real host truly serve the outrageous spectacles they describe? Perhaps a few did, in the giddiest, richest years of the empire. Perhaps most Roman dinners were far more modest, and the satirists were mocking a tendency rather than a norm. But the fact that the joke landed at all tells you that Roman society recognized the type, the grasping host drowning his guests in ostentatious wine and ridiculous food. You cannot satirize a thing that nobody does. What matters for our journey is this. For both Greeks and Romans, wine was not simply a drink. It was a technology of togetherness, carefully mixed, carefully managed, wrapped in ritual and rank and rules, and yet forever slipping loose into loudness and excess. It lubricated philosophy and friendship and love, and it also produced hangovers, feuds, and the occasional flung goblet. It was, in the truest sense, the everyday drug of the ancient world, so woven into daily life that nobody thought to question it. But here is where our story takes a darker and stranger turn, because the ancients did not always leave their wine as simple wine. Sometimes, into that carefully mixed cup they stirred other things, herbs, resins, roots, and occasionally substances a good deal more powerful and a good deal more dangerous than the grape alone. What exactly went into an ancient cup is our next, slightly unsettling question. Here is something that will make you look at that innocent ancient wine cup rather differently. To the Greeks and Romans, wine was not just a drink to be enjoyed on its own. It was a solvent, a carrier, a base into which all manner of other substances could be dissolved and delivered. If you wanted to give someone a medicine, you mixed it into wine. If you wanted to flavour a dull vintage, you added herbs and honey and resin. And if you wanted to give someone an experience rather more intense than ordinary drunkenness, or occasionally to give them no more experiences ever again, wine was the perfect vehicle for that too. Start with the everyday additions, because even ordinary ancient wine was a stranger drink than you might think. Much of it was flavoured and preserved with pine resin, giving it a sharp, piney taste that survives to this day in Greek Retsina, a wine that people either adore or describe uncharitably as furniture polish. Wine was spiced with pepper, sweetened with honey, thickened with boiled-down grape, syrup, and infused with herbs like myrrh and saffron. A Roman recipe book that survives from antiquity, attributed to a gourmet named Apicius, includes a spiced honeyed wine served at the start of a meal, a sort of ancient aperitif that would not be entirely out of place at a modern Christmas. But here is where it gets darker, and here is your solid fact. Ancient sources tell us that a whole pharmacy of powerful mind-altering plants could be, and sometimes were, added to wine. The list is genuinely alarming. Henbane, mandrake, deadly nightshade, thornapple, hellebore, opium poppy, even darnel, a grass whose seeds could be infected with the same ergot fungus we will meet later at the Sacred Mysteries. These are not gentle herbs. These are members of the nightshade family and their equally sinister cousins. Plants packed with compounds that can cause vivid hallucinations, delirium, racing hearts, and, in the wrong dose, death. And the ancients knew it and stirred them into wine anyway, for medicine, for magic, for pleasure, and for murder. Why on earth would anyone drink such a thing on purpose? Well, in careful medicinal doses, these plants really did do useful things. A little henbane or mandrake in wine could deaden pain, calm a frantic patient, or bring sleep to someone who could not otherwise find it. Wine laced with the right herb was one of the few tools a doctor had against agony, and we will see it used remarkably as a surgical anaesthetic. In the world of magic and ritual, these hallucinogenic plants could produce visions that felt genuinely divine, which made them powerful tools for anyone claiming a hotline to the gods. And in the shadier corners of society, the very same knowledge made wine the perfect delivery system for a discreet and deniable poisoning. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is a slightly grim one. The ancients understood the concept of the spiked drink so well that they built whole legends and legal cases around it. A cup of wine handed to you by the wrong person at the wrong dinner could be the last thing you ever tasted, and everyone knew it. This is why powerful, nervous Romans sometimes employed a food taster, a servant whose unenviable job was to sample the master's food and drink first, and ideally, to keel over before the master did. It was a career with excellent job security and truly appalling life expectancy. One imagines the interview as brief, and the pension plan non-existent. Historians still argue about how common deliberate drugging and poisoning by wine actually was, as opposed to how common the fear of it was. The ancient sources are full of poisonings, but many of them are rumours, political smears, and convenient explanations for deaths that might have been perfectly natural. When a healthy emperor suddenly died after dinner, poison was always the whispered suspicion, whether or not any poison was involved. So the Roman world may have been less thoroughly poisoned than its gossips believed, and more thoroughly paranoid. But the knowledge was real, the plants were real, the recipes were real, and at least some of the poisonings, as we will see, were absolutely real. The fear was not baseless. It was just perhaps inflated by a society that loved a dramatic story about a scheming relative and a fatal cup. What I find most striking is the sheer casual expertise of it all. An educated ancient person had a working knowledge of the plant world that would put most of us to shame. They knew which root soothed and which one killed, which leaf brought sleep and which brought visions, how much was medicine and how much was murder. This was not secret wizardry. It was practical, everyday knowledge, passed down through families of herb sellers and doctors and, yes, poisoners, as ordinary in its way as knowing which mushrooms in the woods are safe to eat. They lived closer to the plants than we do, and the plants, in turn, held more power over their lives and deaths. So the next time you picture an ancient banquet, all reclining couches and warm wine and philosophical chatter, add a faint, uneasy shimmer to the scene. Somewhere in that cheerful room, someone knows exactly what a pinch of the right dried root would do if it found its way into a cup. Usually it never does. The wine is just wine, the evening is just an evening, and everyone goes home merely drunk. But the knowledge is always there, quietly, at the edge of the lamplight. Enough of the shadows for now. Let us step back into the daylight and into the hands of the people who studied these plants most carefully of all, not to harm, but to heal. The doctors of the ancient world were about to turn all this scattered plant lore into something remarkable, a science of drugs, written down and handed forward across the centuries. Long before Rome ruled the world, the Greeks had begun the slow, patient work of turning scattered folk knowledge about plants into something more like medicine. And at the fountainhead of that tradition stands a name you already know, Hippocrates, the physician of the island of Kos, who lived in the 5th and 4th centuries before the Common Era, and whose name is still spoken every time a new doctor takes an oath. The Hippocratic writings, a large collection of medical texts produced by Hippocrates and his followers, mark a genuine turning point, an attempt to explain illness through observation and nature rather than through curses and angry gods. And in among those writings, the poppy appears. The Hippocratic doctors knew opium and prescribed poppy preparations for a range of complaints. They understood it as a powerful ally against pain, and above all against sleeplessness. To a physician with almost no other tools against suffering, a drug that could reliably quiet a patient and grant them rest was close to miraculous. Imagine practicing medicine in a world with no proper anaesthetic, no reliable painkiller, nothing to offer a person in agony but a few plants and a soothing voice. In that world, the poppy was not a vice. It was one of the most precious things in the entire medical cupboard. Here is a detail worth holding on to, and it is your fact for this section. The ancient physicians tended to prize opium first and foremost as a sleep bringer, rather than purely as a painkiller. Dioscorides, whom we will properly meet in a moment, described the poppy's chief virtue as its soporific quality, its power to bring sleep. This is a subtle but revealing emphasis. We tend to think of opium and its descendants primarily as painkillers, and of course the ancients used it that way too. But to them, the gift of sleep itself was central, the blessed switching off of a restless, suffering mind. In a world without any of our modern comforts, the ability to guarantee a person a night of deep, dreamless rest was worth its weight in gold. The philosopher-botanist Theophrastus, Aristotle's brilliant successor whom we met earlier admiring the poppy, also studied its juice and its effects with the same careful eye he turned on every growing thing. Between the Hippocratic doctors and the botanists like Theophrastus, the Greeks were building up a body of real, observed, transmissible knowledge about how these plants behaved in the human body. They were, in their way, doing pharmacology, centuries before anyone had a word for it. They just did it with their eyes, their notebooks, and a great many patients who, frankly, did not have a lot of say in the matter. Here is your quirky tidbit. The Greek doctors did not only give opium by mouth. Ancient medical texts describe using poppy in an astonishing variety of ways, mixed into drinks, formed into pills, applied as poultices, and even, in some recipes, dripped into the ear or worn as an amulet. There is a certain charm in imagining a Greek physician gravely prescribing that a poppy preparation be poured, of all places, onto the top of the head to encourage sleep, which really was recommended by some. Whether it worked or was simply a very relaxing scalp treatment, we cannot say, but you have to admire the willingness to experiment. When your medicine cabinet is mostly plants, you get creative about the delivery. Historians still argue about just how sophisticated ancient pain management really was. On one hand, the doctors clearly had access to genuinely effective substances, opium chief among them, plus mandrake and henbane, and they used them with real skill. On the other hand, they had no way to measure a dose precisely, no understanding of the underlying chemistry, and no reliable way to standardize the strength of a given batch. So ancient pain relief was a strange mixture of the remarkably effective and the alarmingly hit or miss. A skilled physician with good opium could ease terrible suffering. A careless one with a strong batch could ease a patient right out of this world entirely. The line, as always, was the dose, and the dose was mostly guesswork. But do not let the guesswork fool you into thinking these people were fools. They were not. They were careful, curious, observant, and often deeply humane. The Hippocratic tradition included a strong ethical streak, a sense that the physician's job was to help, and, at the very least, to do no harm. Faced with a suffering, dying patient in a world with no hospitals, no surgery worth the name, and no cure for most serious diseases, the ancient doctor reached for the poppy not out of recklessness, but out of compassion. Sometimes the only mercy medicine could offer was sleep, and the poppy could give it. There is something quietly moving in that, I think, as you lie there tonight, warm and safe and able to reach for a glass of water or a pill, or a doctor's phone, number whenever you need one, For most of human history, none of that existed. There was pain, and there was the poppy, and there were careful, worried physicians trying to weigh one against, the other with nothing but experience to guide them. Every dose was a small gamble against suffering, made in good faith, in the flickering lamplight of a world that had so very little else to offer. The Greeks laid the foundation, but the man who would gather all this plant knowledge together into a single, magnificent, wildly influential book was not a philosopher in an Athenian garden. He was a working doctor who marched with the Roman army, treating soldiers, seeing the whole sprawling empire and writing down everything he learned about every useful plant he could find. His book would outlive the empire itself and be trusted for the next 1500 years. His name was Dioscorides, and he is where we go next. And so the poppy that gave sleep could also give death, and the wise physician kept both possibilities always in mind. That double nature, comfort in one hand and danger in the other, is the shadow we follow now. Somewhere in the 1st century of the Common Era, a Greek physician named Pedanius Dioscorides, born in the town of Anazarbus in the region of Cilicia, in what is now southern Turkey, set out to do something no one had quite managed before. He wanted to gather all the scattered, tangled, contradictory knowledge about medicinal plants and substances into one clear, organised, reliable reference work, and he was in an excellent position to do it, because Dioscorides served as a doctor with the Roman army, which meant he travelled widely across the empire, seeing plants, remedies, and local practices from many different lands. The result of his labours was a 5-volume masterpiece written in Greek, known ever since by the Latin name De Materia Medica, which means roughly on medical material. In it, Dioscorides described around 1,000 different drugs and remedies, most of them derived from plants, along with substances from animals and minerals. For each one, he set out what it looked like, where it grew, how to prepare it, what it was good for, and crucially how much was safe and how much was dangerous. It was in effect the pharmacist's Bible of the ancient world, and here is your genuinely staggering fact. This single book remained the leading pharmacological reference in the Western and Islamic worlds for something like 1,500 years, 15 centuries. From the Roman Empire through the entire Middle Ages right up to the Renaissance, doctors and apothecaries reached for Dioscorides. No textbook you studied from will still be in serious professional use in the year 3500. His was. Within its pages, Dioscorides treated the powerful, dangerous drugs with particular care. Opium, mandrake, henbane, hemlock, aconite, and hellebore all get their careful entries. And what shines through is his sober, professional caution. Again and again he warns his readers about dosage, reminding them that these substances are powerful, that a small amount heals and a larger amount harms, and that some of them, taken to excess, will simply kill. This is not the writing of a reckless enthusiast. It is the writing of a careful clinician who has clearly seen what these plants can do when they are respected, and worse, what they do when they are not. His entry on the opium poppy is a small model of ancient professionalism. He explains how to harvest the juice, distinguishes the potent pure sap from the weaker whole plant preparation, describes its power to ease pain and bring sleep, and then, in the same breath, warns that too much of it makes people lethargic and can kill them. Heal, help, and harm, all catalogued with the same steady hand. He was telling his readers the truth, that the very thing that made opium precious also made it lethal, and that the whole of the physician's art lay in knowing exactly where the safe amount ended. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is a delightful one for a lover of old books. Some of the surviving copies of Dioscorides are among the most beautiful manuscripts to come down to us from the ancient world. One especially famous version, produced in the early 6th century for a Roman noblewoman, is a gorgeously illustrated volume filled with painted pictures of the plants, page after page of carefully rendered leaves and roots and flowers. It is a working medical text that also happens to be a treasure of art, which feels exactly right for a book, about substances that were themselves both practical and almost magical. Imagine a pharmacy manual so lovely that it ended up as a prized possession of emperors and collectors. That is the status Dioscorides achieved. Historians still argue about how much of Dioscorides was truly his own careful observation, and how much he inherited and compiled from earlier writers whose works are now lost to us. Ancient authors did not footnote their sources the way modern scholars do. and Dioscorides was clearly building on generations of accumulated herb lore. Some scholars see him as a great original observer, others see him more as a brilliant organizer, a man whose genius lay in gathering, sorting, and clearly presenting the knowledge of his age. Rather than in discovering it all himself, the honest answer is probably a bit of both, and honestly, either way the achievement is enormous. Whether he found the knowledge or merely tamed it, he handed it forward across 15 centuries, and that is a gift almost beyond measuring. What I want you to take from Dioscorid is, as you drift there in the warm dark, is his tone. It is calm, it is careful, it is deeply, reassuringly professional. Here was a man who handled the most dangerous substances of his world, opium and hemlock and mandrake and all the rest, not with fear and not with reckless excitement, but with the quiet respect of an expert who understood exactly what he was dealing with. He neither demonized these drugs nor glamorized them. He simply told the truth about them, dose by dose, plant by plant, and trusted his readers to use that truth wisely. In a strange way, Dioscorides is the moral centre of our whole story. All around him, in the markets and the dinner parties and the shadowy back rooms, people were using these same substances for pleasure, for oblivion, for magic, and for murder. And here was this steady, sober army doctor, quietly writing it all down properly, insisting that knowledge and caution were the only real. Protection against the dangers of the pharmacon. He could not stop people from misusing these drugs, but he could, and did, make sure that the truth about them survived. That truth included a warning he returned to again and again, the dark edge of the poppy's gift. And it is to that dark edge, the danger hidden inside the comfort, that we must turn next. He gave the ancient world a map through a dangerous landscape, and for 1,500 years, people were grateful to have it. Few authors have ever done so much good for so long from a single, patient, sober book. The ancients were not naive about opium. This is one of the most important things to understand tonight, because it is tempting to imagine that people 2,000 years ago simply did not grasp the dangers of the drugs they used so freely, but they did. They watched, they noticed, and they wrote it down with unsettling clarity. Dioscorides put it about as plainly as anyone ever has. A little opium, he warned, taken in an amount no larger than a small seed, is a pain easer, a sleep bringer, and a digester. But taken in too great a quantity, he wrote, it hurts, making men lethargic, and it kills. That is the whole terrible truth of the poppy in a single sentence, written down in the 1st century and just as accurate today. Think about what that warning actually means. The ancients understood that this was a substance where the gap between the helpful dose and the fatal dose was frighteningly narrow. A grain too much was not a stronger medicine. It was a slow, sleepy death. And because they had no way to measure or standardize their doses precisely, every use of opium carried a quiet element of risk, a small roll of the dice, especially when the strength of the batch was unknown. The good physicians managed this with experience and caution. The careless, the desperate, and the unlucky did not always manage it at all. Here is your fact, and it is a sombre one. The ancient sources are quite clear that opium was, at times, used deliberately to end life. It was employed in suicides. In a world of incurable diseases, unbearable pain, political disgrace, and looming execution, a fatal dose of opium offered what some saw as a gentle exit, a way to slip out of an intolerable life through the door of sleep rather than through violence. The same drug that a physician used to grant a suffering patient a few hours of rest could, in a larger measure, grant a permanent one. The Romans, with their strong cultural strain of stoicism about death, did not always regard this as we might. To choose the manner of your own ending was, to some Roman minds, matter of dignity rather than despair. And the doctors clearly noticed something that sounds a great deal like what we would call dependence and tolerance. Roman writers observed that habitual users seemed to need the drug, and to need more of it over time. The whole grim architecture of addiction, the growing tolerance, the reliance, the discomfort when the drug is withdrawn, was visible to careful ancient observers even without any of the modern science to explain it. They saw the pattern in the people around them, and some of them wrote about it with real concern. This was not a society blind to the hooks hidden inside its favourite comforts. It was a society that saw the hooks clearly and, for the most part, decided the comfort was worth the risk anyway. Which, if you think about our own age of prescriptions and pharmacies, is not a decision we're in any strong position to judge. Here is your quirky and frankly rather dark tidbit. The ancients used opium on children. Fussy babies, teething infants, little ones who would not settle, were sometimes dosed with poppy preparations to quiet them and send them to sleep. To a modern parent, this is genuinely horrifying, and it should be, because the dose that soothes an adult can easily overwhelm a tiny body. But set aside your justified alarm for a moment and consider the exhausted ancient parent, up for the 5th night running with a screaming infant in a world with no other remedy, reaching for the one thing everybody knew would bring sleep. It is not hard to understand, even as you wince. Parents have been desperate for a full night's sleep for as long as there have been parents, and the poppy, terrifyingly, delivered. This particular practice remarkably persisted in various forms right up into relatively modern times, long after antiquity, in soothing syrups you would be shocked to read the ingredients of. Historians still argue about how widespread genuine opium addiction really was in the ancient world, as opposed to widespread ordinary use. Some scholars point out that despite the drug's easy availability and the doctor's awareness of dependence, there is surprisingly little clear evidence of a large population of what we would call addicts. Others suspect that dependence was more common than the sources let on, simply because the ancients had no strong concept of addiction as a distinct problem to be recorded and worried over. When everybody uses a substance and nobody thinks it shameful, the addicts do not stand out. They are just people who use a bit more than most, in a world where using it at all is completely normal. So the true scale of ancient opium dependence may be hidden from us precisely because nobody at the time thought it worth counting. The one great glaring exception, the single most famous possible case of opium dependence in all of antiquity, sits right at the top of the Roman world. It is the very man we began with, lying awake in his campaign tent on the cold Danube frontier, reaching in the dark for his daily dose. The most powerful person alive, and quite possibly, according to some readings of the evidence, quietly hooked on the dried tears of the poppy. It is time we return to Marcus Aurelius, and to the brilliant, exasperating physician who mixed his medicine and left us the clues. So hold that narrow, dangerous line in your mind, the hair's breadth between the dose that soothes and the dose that kills. Everyone in the ancient world walked it, from the market stall to the imperial couch, and no one, perhaps, walked it more visibly, or with higher stakes, than the philosopher who ruled an empire while leaning night after night on his little cup of comfort. Marcus Aurelius is, by almost any measure, one of the most admirable figures the ancient world produced. He was emperor of Rome from the year 161 to 180, and he ruled through plague, war, and endless crisis with a patience and seriousness of purpose that later ages found deeply moving. He's remembered above all as a philosopher, the author of the Meditations, a private notebook of stoic reflections written for his own eyes, full of gentle, hard-won wisdom about duty, mortality, and keeping your soul steady in a chaotic world. It is one of the most beloved books ever written, and its author, this thoughtful, dutiful, self-disciplined man, appears to have spent much of his later life reliant on opium. Our evidence comes largely from two sources, and here is your solid fact. The first is the emperor's own physician, the great Galen, who served at the imperial court and wrote extensively about the theriac, the elaborate compound medicine that Marcus took. The second is the historian Cassius Dio, who tells us that the emperor regularly consumed this opium-containing preparation, in part to cope with the chronic pain in his chest and abdomen that plagued him, and to help him endure the brutal demands of his military campaigns on the northern frontier. Between them, these sources paint a picture of a ruler who leaned on his daily medicine heavily and habitually over a long period of time. The theriac itself was a marvel of ancient pharmacy, a thick electuary containing dozens upon dozens of ingredients, and folded among them opium. We will explore the strange history of theriac properly a little later, because it deserves its own tale. But for now, what matters is Galen's role as the imperial pharmacist. Galen tells us, in his own writings, that he had to manage the emperor's dose with care. When Marcus took too much and became too drowsy, too fogged and sleepy to attend to, the endless business of ruling an empire, Galen would reduce the opium in the mixture, and when the pain returned, or the sleeplessness, Galen would increase it again. He was, in effect, carefully titrating the most powerful man in the world, tuning him like an instrument, dialing the opium up and down to keep him functional. There is something almost unbearably human in that image. Here is the philosopher-emperor, the Stoic sage who wrote so movingly about rising above the body's demands, and here is his doctor, quietly adjusting his opium so that he can get through the day's work without either collapsing in pain or nodding off on the throne. The meditations are full of stern reminders to master one's appetites and endure discomfort with dignity. And all the while, it seems, their author needed his careful daily measure of the poppy just to keep going. That is not hypocrisy. It is simply the gap between the ideals we hold and the frail bodies we hold them in, a gap Marcus himself would probably have contemplated. With rueful understanding, here is your quirky tidbit. Galen was, by universal agreement, one of the most brilliant physicians who ever lived, and also one of the most magnificently arrogant. His surviving writings are enormous, opinionated, and absolutely dripping with confidence in his own genius. He never tired of explaining how right he was and how wrong everybody else had been. So the mental picture of the imperial sick room is a comedy of contrasts. The humble, self-questioning Stoic emperor on one side, forever examining his own faults, and on the other his personal doctor, possibly the single most self-satisfied man in the entire Roman Empire, cheerfully certain that he alone knew exactly what the emperor needed. One imagines Marcus, mid-meditation on the vanity of pride, glancing over at Galen and sighing very deeply. Historians still argue over whether Marcus Aurelius was truly addicted to opium in the full modern sense, or whether he was simply a chronically ill man taking a long-term medication for genuine pain, which is a rather different thing. The line between medical use and dependence is blurry even today, and it is far blurrier at a distance of 18 centuries, working from a few scattered ancient remarks. One reading has him as a tragic near-addict, ruling the world through a haze of poppy. Another, gentler reading has him as a Stoic patient managing real, persistent pain as best he could. With the only effective medicine his age possessed, no more an addict than a modern cancer patient on morphine. We genuinely cannot be certain which is closer to the truth. But the very fact that the question is serious, that the evidence supports the debate at all, tells you how deep opium ran, even into the highest and most disciplined life in the empire, and perhaps that is the most quietly powerful lesson of Marcus Aurelius and his little daily cup. These substances did not respect status, virtue, or wisdom. They reached the beggar in the market and the emperor on the frontier alike. The poppy did not care that Marcus was a philosopher. It did what it always did, easing his pain, granting him sleep, and quite possibly tightening its gentle grip a little more with every passing dose. The greatest Stoic of them all, the man who taught the world to endure, needed help enduring. There is no shame in that. There is only the long familiar human story of pain and comfort, and the price of comfort, playing out on the grandest possible stage. So let the emperor sleep at last, there in his tent by the dark river, his medicine doing its quiet work, his great book of wisdom lying closed beside him. And let us leave the palace and walk back down into the ordinary streets, where opium was not an imperial secret but a common household good, sold and eaten and baked into daily life in ways that might genuinely surprise you. Down in those streets, the poppy wore no crown and hid no secret. It simply sat on the market table, wrapped and waiting, as ordinary as bread. Come down now into the ordinary streets of a Roman town, away from palaces and philosophy, into the world, of markets and kitchens and everyday life. Because this is where the poppy really lived, not as an emperor's secret or a doctor's dangerous tool, but as a common, comfortable, everyday thing, woven into cooking, commerce, and the small rituals of daily existence. To an ordinary Roman, the poppy was not sinister at all. It was familiar, domestic, even wholesome, in a way that can be genuinely disorienting to a modern mind trained to flinch at the word opium. Start with food, because yes, the poppy was food. Poppy seeds, which come from the very same plant, were a common ingredient, sprinkled on bread and cakes and mixed with honey, exactly as they are today on the roll you might buy from a bakery this week. The Romans ate poppy seeds happily and healthily, and poppy seeds, to be clear, will not get anyone high, containing only the faintest traces of the plant's active compounds. But the line between the culinary poppy and the medicinal poppy was blurry in the ancient kitchen, and recipes existed for poppy preparations that were rather more potent than a simple seeded cake. There was a whole gentle spectrum from the harmless sprinkle of seeds on your loaf to the serious business of the scored pods dried juice. Here is your fact, and it is a beautiful little piece of evidence hiding on a coin. The poppy appeared on ancient money, jewellery and pottery, often held in the hands of goddesses of fertility and harvest, right alongside sheaves of grain. On one Roman coin struck in the city of Ephesus, in the years around the reign of the Emperor Titus, the figure of Concord, the goddess of harmony, is shown holding wheat ears and a poppy together in one hand and a cornucopia, a horn of plenty, in the other. Grain and poppy side by side as twin symbols of abundance and well-being. To put the poppy on your coinage as an emblem of harmony and plenty tells you everything about how positively, how unproblematically the ancients regarded this flower. It was a symbol of the good life, not a warning. And the poppy was woven into how the Romans thought about sleep and death. Those two gentle siblings. Poppies were carved onto tombs and funerary monuments, where they carried a soft and rather lovely meaning. They spoke of rest, of release from the pain of life, of an eternal and untroubled sleep. To place a poppy on a grave was to say that the dead had finally been freed from suffering and had passed into a deep and peaceful rest, watched over by the gentle gods of sleep. It is one of the tenderest uses of the flower in the whole ancient repertoire, and it draws directly on everyone's shared practical knowledge of what the poppy actually did, which was to end pain and bring sleep. Here is your quirky tidbit. The Roman god of sleep, Somnus, and his Greek counterpart Hypnos were sometimes depicted scattering poppies, or pouring a sleep-inducing liquid from a horn to send mortals off to their rest. Picture the god of sleep drifting through the night sky, sprinkling poppies over the weary world below, like a sort of narcotic Sandman, and you have captured exactly how the ancient imagination linked this one flower to the daily miracle of falling asleep. Every night, as far as an ancient Roman was concerned, a god was essentially dosing the entire population with dream flowers so they could rest, which is, honestly, a lovelier bedtime image than most of what we tell ourselves, so feel free to borrow it as you drift off tonight. Historians still argue about how sharply the ancients themselves distinguished between the harmless everyday poppy and the powerful medicinal one, given that they use the same word and the same plant for both. Did an ordinary Roman munching a poppy seed cake think about the fact that the very same flower, prepared differently, could kill an emperor's pain or end a life? Almost certainly not most of the time, any more than you think about the chemistry of caffeine while enjoying your morning coffee. The knowledge was there in the culture, available when needed, but it did not haunt the breakfast table. The poppy was simply one of those deep, quiet presences in ancient life, comforting in one form, powerful in another, and utterly unremarkably ordinary in both. That ordinariness is the thing I most want you to feel tonight. We have built such heavy walls around these substances that it takes real effort to imagine a world without them. A world where the poppy was a harvest emblem on a coin, a topping on a cake, a comfort on a tomb, and a medicine in a cup, all at once, all without scandal. It was not a better world or a worse one exactly. It was simply a world that drew its lines in very different places than we draw ours, and lived, on the whole, quite comfortably with substances that would set off every alarm in a modern pharmacy. So we have followed the poppy from the mythical dawn of Greek poetry, to the emperor's tent, to the baker's tray and the carved tomb. It has been our patient guide through the gentle side of the ancient drug world, the side concerned with sleep, comfort, and the easing of pain. But the poppy was not the only powerful plant the ancients reached for. Growing in the same fields, sold at the same stalls, catalogued in the same great books, were plants stranger, and, darker still, plants tangled in legend and dread. And the strangest of them all was a root that, people whispered, was shaped like a human being, and screamed when it was pulled from the earth. And so the humble poppy followed a Roman from the cradle to the grave, seasoning the bread of childhood and crowning the tomb at the end, a quiet companion through an entire ordinary life. Few flowers have ever been trusted so completely, or deserved that trust so uneasily. The mandrake is one of those plants that seems to belong more to fairy tale than to pharmacy, and yet it was a real and important part of ancient medicine. It is a low, unassuming plant of the nightshade family, with broad leaves and small flowers, but its secret and its fame lie underground, in its thick forked root. And that root, in older specimens, can branch and twist in a way that looks, if you squint and are perhaps a little suggestible, unnervingly like a human figure with something resembling legs, arms, and a rounded head. To the ancient mind, a plant whose root took the shape of a person was clearly no ordinary vegetable. It was charged with mystery and power, and the Greeks and Romans treated it accordingly. The Greeks sometimes called the mandrake by the name of the enchantress herself, associating it with Circe, whose potions turned men into pigs. Circe's root, they called it, tying this real plant directly back to the mythical world of transformation and magic we visited earlier. And this was not just poetry. The mandrake genuinely does contain powerful compounds, members of a chemical family that can cause drowsiness, hallucinations, delirium, and, in sufficient quantity, a dangerous slowing of the body's functions. The ancients did not know the chemistry, but they knew the effects intimately. They knew that mandrake could send a person into a deep, strange sleep, and they knew it could tip over into poisoning and death. Circe's root, indeed. Here is your fact, and it is the one that matters most for our story. The ancient physicians used mandrake, quite deliberately and quite skillfully, as a sedative and a pain reliever, and above all as a way of putting patients into a deep sleep before surgery. Dioscorides, our careful army doctor, describes preparing a wine from mandrake root and giving it to people who were about to be cut or cauterized, so that they would sleep through the ordeal and feel nothing, or as close to nothing as ancient medicine could manage. Read that again and let it land. 2,000 years ago, doctors were using a plant-based drug specifically to render surgical patients unconscious and insensible to pain. This is anesthesia, in its ancient, herbal, deeply courageous form, and mandrake sat right at the heart of it. Imagine the scene, and it will make you grateful for your own century. A patient faces an operation in a world with no reliable anesthetic, no antiseptic, no real understanding of infection. The surgeon's tools are laid out, and the one mercy available, the one thing standing between the patient and unimaginable agony, is a cup of mandrake wine, carefully dosed, that will pull them down into a heavy sleep and with luck keep them there until the worst is over. Too little, and they wake screaming mid-procedure. Too much, and they never wake at all. The physician had to thread that needle by experience and instinct alone. It was terrifying, and it was also, given the alternative, an act of profound compassion. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is the famous one. There grew up around the mandrake a persistent legend that the root, being so like a living person, would let out a terrible scream when it was torn from the ground, a scream so dreadful that it could kill or madden anyone who heard it. To harvest it safely, the stories advised, you should never pull it up with your own hands. Instead, you should loosen the soil around it, tie the root to a dog, and then step well back and call the dog so that the poor animal pulled the shrieking root free and suffered the deadly cry in your place. This grisly bit of folklore became especially elaborate in later medieval times, but its roots, if you will forgive me, reach back into the ancient world's sense that this was a plant more alive, more person-like, more dangerous than any other, a vegetable you needed to outsource the harvesting of to a dog for your own safety. Poor dog. Historians still argue about how much of the mandrake's fearsome reputation was based on its real pharmacological punch and how much was pure magical thinking spun out of its human-shaped root. The plant really is a potent and dangerous member of the nightshade family, so the fear was not baseless. But the specific legends, the killing scream, the necessity of the sacrificial dog, clearly belong to the realm of folklore rather than medicine. What is fascinating is how the two strands, the genuine pharmacology and the pure superstition, wound together around this single strange plant, so that the mandrake was simultaneously a respectable surgical anaesthetic in a doctor's careful hands and a shrieking magical horror in the popular imagination. Both things at once, in the same forked root. And that really is the mandrake's place in our story. It shows us the ancient world reaching, with remarkable ingenuity and remarkable bravery, toward one of the great goals of medicine, the abolition of pain, using nothing but the plants at hand. It shows us doctors deliberately inducing unconsciousness for surgery centuries upon centuries before the discovery of ether and modern anaesthetics. And it shows us, in the Screaming Root legend, the fear and wonder that these powerful plants inspired, the sense that in handling them you were touching something that stood on the very border, between the natural and the supernatural. The mandrake rarely worked alone, though. In the hands of the ancient surgeons it was often combined with other sleep-bringing plants into a single, potent preparation, soaked into an object you would never guess, and held over a patient's face to carry them down into the dark. That object, and the strange and clever way the ancients used it, is where we turn next. Picture the surgeon lifting a curious dripping object toward the sleeping patient's face, and you have already glimpsed one of the strangest and cleverest tools in the whole ancient medical kit. It is a small marvel, and it deserves a closer look. The object the ancient surgeon lifted toward his sleeping patient's face was, of all humble things, a sponge, a simple sea sponge, the same soft, porous creature the Romans used every day in their baths and their kitchens. But this was no ordinary sponge. This one had been soaked in a powerful brew of the strongest sleep-bringing plants the ancient world possessed, then dried and stored, ready to be woken again when the knife was needed. It was called, in the medical tradition that grew up around it, the spongia somnifera, the sleep-bringing sponge, and it is one of the most ingenious and eerie inventions in the whole history of medicine. The recipe varied, but the core idea was consistent and clever. You took a sponge and steeped it in a concentrated infusion of the great trio of ancient sedatives, opium, mandrake, and henbane, sometimes with other herbs added for good measure. Then you let the sponge dry, locking all that chemical power into its fibres, where it could be kept until needed. When the time came for surgery, you rehydrated the sponge with hot water, and the warmth released the drugs back into a fragrant, potent vapour and liquid. The sponge was then held over the patient's nose and mouth, and as they breathed in the rising fumes, they sank down gradually into a deep and merciful sleep. And then, only then, did the surgery begin. Here is your fact, and it is a genuinely remarkable one. The plants in that sponge, opium, mandrake, and henbane contain, respectively, morphine, scopolamine, and atropine, compounds that modern medicine still recognizes and, in refined form, still uses today. Morphine remains one of our most important painkillers. Scopolamine and atropine are real drugs with real uses in modern surgery and anesthesia, so the ancient sleep sponge was not folk nonsense. It was, in its crude and dangerous way, delivering a cocktail of genuinely effective, genuinely powerful anesthetic and sedative compounds, the same active substances in principle that a modern anaesthetist might draw upon. The ancients had stumbled, through centuries of careful observation, onto a real and working chemistry of unconsciousness. But do not let the cleverness distract you from the sheer terror of it. This was medicine walking a knife edge over an abyss. There was no way to measure the dose in that sponge with any precision. The strength depended on the plants, the batch, the soaking, the drying, the temperature of the water, and the individual patient's own body. Hold the sponge too briefly, and the patient stirs and wakes into the middle of their own operation, a nightmare almost too awful to contemplate. Hold it too long or make the brew too strong, and they slide past sleep into something deeper and permanent and simply never wake up at all. The surgeon was gambling with his patient's life at both ends, trying to find that narrow band of true unconsciousness between agony and death, armed with nothing but a damp sponge and hard-won experience. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is a tribute to the sheer staying power of a good idea. The sleep sponge did not die with the ancient world. The knowledge was preserved, refined, and carried forward, particularly through the great medical traditions of the medieval Islamic world, and versions of the spongia somnifera were used in European surgery right through the Middle Ages and beyond for well over 1,000 years. This single technique, this drug-soaked sponge held over a frightened face, remained one of the best options humanity had for surgical anesthesia until the discovery of ether in the 19th century finally offered something better. Think of that unbroken chain, generation after generation of surgeons and patients, all relying on essentially the same soggy, potent object, from the Roman world almost to the age of the telephone. Some inventions are simply too useful to abandon, however frightening they are. Historians still argue about how reliable and how widely used the sleep sponge really was, and how often it worked, as intended versus how often it failed in one direction or the other. The surviving recipes and descriptions are real, but they do not come with success rates, and we have no way to count how many patients slept peacefully through their surgery, and how many woke screaming or never woke at all. Some scholars suspect the technique was more talked about than reliably practiced. Others believe it was a genuine, if perilous, working tool of the ancient and medieval surgeon. What is beyond doubt is the ambition behind it, the determination to defeat surgical pain by any means available, and the remarkable pharmacological instinct that led the ancients to combine exactly those plants that we now know contain exactly the right active compounds. There is a kind of quiet heroism in the whole thing when you sit with it. Faced with the brutal necessity of cutting into a living, conscious human being in a world without any of the safeguards we take for granted, the ancient doctors did not simply shrug and reach for the strongest patient holders they could find. They thought, they experimented, they drew on everything their tradition knew about the sleep-bringing plants, and they built, out of a sponge and a handful of dangerous roots and saps, a genuine tool for the abolition of pain. It was imperfect and it was perilous, but it was real, and it eased untold suffering across more than a millennium. The plants that filled that sponge, though, had lives of their own beyond the surgeon's table. Henbane, in particular, that third member of the great sedative trio, was a plant with a dark and fascinating reputation all its own, a plant tangled up with madness, magic, and a strange proverb about sailing to a particular town for a cure. It belongs to a whole sinister family of plants, and that family is where we wander next, deeper into the ancient world's cabinet of beautiful, useful, and thoroughly dangerous poisons. Let us open, carefully, the ancient world's cabinet of dangerous plants and meet the nightshade family properly. This is a group of plants that has fascinated and frightened humanity for thousands of years, and for very good reason. It includes henbane, deadly nightshade, which is also called belladonna, and the thornapple, along with the mandrake we have already met. These plants share a family of powerful chemical compounds that act on the human nervous system in dramatic ways, causing dilated pupils, racing, hearts, flushed skin, wild hallucinations, delirium, and, in sufficient dose, coma and death. They are beautiful, some of them, with their glossy berries and pale flowers, and they are among the most dangerous. Plants that grow in the temperate world. Henbane, that third ingredient of the surgeon's sleep sponge, was well known to the ancients as a sedative and a painkiller, but also as a plant that could tip a person into a strange and frightening delirium. Its very name in some later tongues means, essentially, killer of hens, a nod to its poisonous power. The ancients used it in small, careful doses to deaden pain, calm the frantic and bring troubled sleep, and they knew that a larger dose brought raving madness, and beyond that, death. It sat, like so much of our story, right on that razor's edge between medicine and poison, useful in a trained hand and lethal in a careless or a wicked one. Deadly nightshade, belladonna, carries its danger in its very name in some languages and its beauty in another, for belladonna means beautiful lady. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it reaches beyond the ancient world, but it is too good to leave out. That lovely name is thought to come from a cosmetic use of the plant. Drops made from it were used in later centuries to widen a woman's pupils, which was considered alluring, giving the eyes a large, dark, dreamy look. So a plant deadly enough to kill was also in dilute form a beauty product, dropped into the eyes to make them more attractive. The nightshades were forever like this, wearing the mask of beauty or medicine over a genuinely lethal core. Nothing about them was ever simple, and everything about them was a gamble. Now here is your solid fact, and it comes with one of the best proverbs the ancient world ever produced. There was another powerful plant the ancients relied upon, called hellebore, which they used among other things as a drastic purge and remarkably as a supposed treatment for madness and mental illness. The town of Anticyra in Greece became so famous for its supply of hellebore and its treatment of the mentally troubled that it gave rise to a stock phrase. To tell someone to sail to Anticyra was the ancient equivalent of telling them they were out of their mind and needed treatment, a polite classical way of saying you should have your head examined. Roman writers used the phrase with relish. Imagine insulting someone's sanity not by tapping your temple, but by suggesting they book passage to a particular spa town famous for its madness cure. It is such a wonderfully specific insult that it makes you a little sad we have lost it. Sail to Anticyra, my friend, take the long route. Hellebore, it must be said, was a genuinely dangerous drug, and the ancient physicians treated its use as a serious and risky business. Administering it was thought to require great care and a strong patient, because the plant could easily overwhelm and kill the very person it was meant to cure. There is something poignant in the image of ancient doctors dosing the mentally ill with a violent purgative in the sincere belief that they were driving out the illness, when in truth they were often simply poisoning already suffering people. But it was done in earnest, as real medicine, by people genuinely trying to help, with the only tools their understanding allowed. We should be slow to laugh, given how confidently every age, including our own, deploys treatments that later ages will find bewildering. Historians still argue about how the ancients managed to use these ferociously toxic plants as often as they apparently did without simply killing everyone who took them. Part of the answer is that dose really is everything, and skilled practitioners had generations of accumulated experience about how much was safe. Part of it is that the sources probably record the successes and the dramatic failures while staying silent about the ordinary, unremarkable poisonings that surely occurred. And part of it, frankly, is that ancient patients were tougher, or at least more fatalistic than we are, living as they did in a world where the risk of death was simply the constant background hum of existence. When every illness might kill you anyway, a dangerous cure looks a good deal more reasonable than it does to us, cushioned as we are by modern medicine. What ties this whole dark family together, henbane and belladonna and thornapple and hellebore and mandrake, is that recurring ancient truth we keep circling back to. The truth captured in that single word, pharmakon. Every one of these plants was medicine and poison at once. Everyone could ease suffering or cause it, cure madness or induce it, grant, sleep or death, depending entirely on the dose and the hand that gave it. The ancients did not have the luxury of clean, safe, precisely measured drugs. They had these wild, potent, temperamental plants, and they used them anyway, with courage and caution and no small amount of prayer, because the alternative was to offer their suffering patients nothing at all. But some of these plants were used not to heal and not to seek visions, but for a single cold purpose: the deliberate ending of a human life. And no plant in the ancient world is more famous for that grim role than the one that killed a philosopher whose name still echoes through every classroom in the world. In the year 399 before the Common Era, in the city of Athens, the philosopher Socrates was sentenced to death. He had been convicted, on charges of corrupting the young and disrespecting the city's gods, in a trial that has troubled the conscience of the Western world ever since. And the method of his execution was a cup of poison, brewed from one of the most notorious plants of the ancient world, hemlock. The account of his death, written by his devoted student Plato in the dialogue known as the Phaedo, is one of the most famous and most moving death scenes ever recorded, and it gives us an extraordinarily vivid picture of exactly what this poison did. Hemlock is an innocent-looking plant, a tall, feathery member of the carrot and parsley family, with lacy white flowers, easily mistaken for something harmless. But it contains a powerful poison that attacks the nervous system in a slow, creeping, methodical way, and Plato's account describes its effects with chilling clinical precision. According to the story, Socrates drank the cup calmly, with the composure of a man who had made his peace, and then walked about a little, as the jailer had instructed, until his legs began to grow heavy. Then he lay down, and the man who had administered the poison pressed on his feet and legs, asking if he could feel anything, and Socrates said no. The numbness and the cold crept slowly upward through his body, from the feet toward the heart, and Socrates, remaining lucid and serene almost to the very end, understood that when the cold reached his heart he would be gone. Here is your fact, drawn straight from that account. The description of hemlock poisoning that Plato gives us, the gradual paralysis. Rising from the extremities upward, the coldness and heaviness climbing through the limbs, the mind remaining clear as the body shuts down, is broadly consistent with what we now understand about how the poison in hemlock actually works. It causes a creeping, ascending paralysis of the muscles, and death comes when the muscles needed for breathing finally fail. Plato was not writing a scientific treatise, but his portrait of the dying Socrates carries the ring of real observation, a genuine record of what those in the room actually saw as the great philosopher slipped away. It is history and poison and philosophy all bound together in a single unforgettable scene. What makes the death of Socrates so haunting is not the horror of it, but the calm. He does not rage or weep or beg. He discusses the immortality of the soul with his friends until nearly the end, reassures them, even makes a wry final remark, and meets the rising cold with a philosopher's steadiness. It became, for later generations, the very model of a good death, a death faced with reason and dignity intact. And the instrument of that famous philosophical death was simply a plant, a common weed of the roadside and the riverbank brewed into a cup. The pharmakon again, in its darkest role, but wrapped this time in one of the noblest stories the ancient world ever told. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is a small linguistic delight. That same Greek word we keep meeting, pharmakon, is exactly the word used for the fatal draught given to Socrates. The cup of hemlock is a pharmakon, and so is the healing medicine a doctor gives, and so is Helen's sorrow-banishing drug, and so is Circe's transforming potion. The Athenians did not have one word for medicine and another for poison. They had this single, slippery, magnificent word that held all of it at once, and only the context told you. Which face it was wearing. The very language forced you to remember that the healer's art and the poisoner's art were, at bottom, the same knowledge pointed in different directions. There is a whole philosophy folded into that one stubborn word. Historians still argue about some of the finer details of the Socrates account, including whether the poison he drank was pure hemlock alone, or hemlock mixed with other substances to make it act more smoothly and reliably. Some scholars have wondered whether the notably calm, painless death Plato describes fully matches what pure hemlock would do, and have suggested the Athenian executioners may have refined their fatal recipe over the years for a cleaner result. Others defend Plato's account as essentially accurate. We cannot settle it now across so many centuries, but the debate itself is a reminder that even the most famous death in philosophy comes down in the end to a question of pharmacology, of exactly what was in that cup and exactly how it did its work. The execution of Socrates shows us poison in its most public, most official, most solemn form, a poison handed over by the state, in daylight, as a legal punishment, sanctioned and recorded and mourned. But poison had another life in the ancient world, a life lived in shadow rather than daylight, in whispers rather than lawful verdicts. In the corridors of power, especially in Rome, poison became something else entirely, a quiet weapon of ambition, a tool for clearing rivals and settling scores, dreaded precisely because it could not be seen coming. A cup of wine at dinner, a dish passed by a smiling relative, and a healthy person dead by morning with no wound and no proof. That shadow world of secret poisoning and the deep corrosive fear it bred in Roman society is where we go next. It is a darker corner of our journey, but a fascinating one, full of dread and suspicion, and one truly remarkable woman who turned murder into a profession. So keep the image of the calm philosopher in your mind as a kind of anchor, and let us step from the honest daylight of his death into the whispering shadows of the imperial court. Keep the calm philosopher in your mind as a kind of anchor, a fixed and honest star as we leave the daylight behind. What waits ahead is far less noble and far more Roman. Rome, at the height of its power, was a society quietly obsessed with the fear of poison. Among the wealthy and the powerful, where fortunes and thrones and inheritances were at stake, the possibility of a discreet poisoning hung over every banquet and every cup like a faint, persistent shadow. This was not entirely irrational paranoia. Poison was real, it was available, it was hard to detect, and it left no obvious mark, which made it the ideal weapon for anyone who wanted. A rival, a relative, or a spouse removed without the mess and risk of open violence. In a world of vast inheritances and murderous ambition, the smiling face across the dinner table might, just might, be planning to watch you die. Here is your fact, and it shows how seriously Rome took the threat. The Romans passed actual legislation against poisoning, most notably a law from the time of the dictator Sulla, in the early 1st century before the Common Era, which dealt with murderers and poisoners together, and set out penalties for those who prepared, sold, or administered harmful drugs with intent to kill. The very existence of such a law tells you that poisoning was common enough and feared enough to require the full attention of the Roman state. And revealingly, the same word sat at the heart of it, the Latin cousin of that Greek pharmakon, a word for drug that could mean either a healing medicine or a deadly poison. Roman law itself had to grapple with the fact that the poisoner and the pharmacist were reaching into the very same cabinet. The fear expressed itself in the daily habits of the powerful. Wealthy, nervous Romans employed food tasters, servants whose grim duty was to sample every dish and cup before their master touched it, so that any poison would strike them down first and give warning. It was, as I said earlier, a job with truly dreadful prospects. But it speaks volumes about the atmosphere of the age that such a role existed at all, that a rich Roman considered it simply prudent to have someone else risk death at every meal. Imagine living in such a way that hiring a professional to eat your food first seemed like ordinary common sense. That is the texture of fear we're talking about, woven right into the act of sitting down to dinner. And the fear fed on itself. because poison is the perfect subject for rumour. When a prominent Roman died suddenly, especially a young or healthy or politically important one, poison was always the first whisper, whether or not any poison had been involved. A convenient death was, almost by reflex, called a suspicious death. This means the ancient sources are absolutely riddled with accusations of poisoning that we can never verify. A swirling fog of suspicion in which real murders and natural deaths and pure political slander are hopelessly mixed together. Half the emperors and princes of Rome are said by someone to have been poisoned. Some surely were, many surely were not. The truth is lost in the very atmosphere of dread that made the accusation so easy to make and so hard to disprove. Here is your quirky tidbit. So deep did this preoccupation run that the Romans came to associate certain notorious real-life poisoners with an almost legendary status, and stories of professional poison makers, often women, circulated widely. The image of the woman who dealt in death, who kept a private pharmacy of lethal substances and hired out her deadly skills to the ambitious, became a fixture of the Roman imagination. And unlike some fears, this one had at least one very solid, very real, and very well-documented basis. A woman whose career of poisoning reached right into the imperial family and who was astonishingly protected and rewarded by an emperor for her services. Rome did not merely imagine its master poisoners. At least one of them genuinely existed, and business, apparently, was good. Historians still argue about how much actual poisoning went on in ancient Rome versus how much was rumour, exaggeration, and convenient scapegoating. Skeptical scholars point out that many alleged poisonings could easily have been natural deaths from the many diseases that stalked the ancient world, misread through a lens of suspicion. Others note that the knowledge, the means, and the motive were all abundantly present, and that at least some of the recorded cases are too well attested to dismiss. The likely truth is that Rome was both genuinely poisoned and wildly paranoid at the same time, that real murders happened often enough to keep the fear alive, and that the fear then multiplied the perceived number of murders far beyond the reality. It was a society that had talked itself into a state where every sudden death looked like foul play, precisely because foul play was so plausible. What is not in doubt is that this dread created a market, and where there is a market, there is a specialist ready to fill it. In the poisonous atmosphere of the imperial court under the Emperor Nero, one woman rose to become the most famous poisoner in all of Roman history, a professional dealer in death whose services were sought at the very highest level, who trained apprentices in her deadly craft, and who was rewarded not with execution, but with country estates. Her name has come down to us across nearly 2,000 years, and her story is one of the darkest and most extraordinary in our entire journey tonight. Her name was Locusta, and to understand her, we have to step right into the murderous heart of one of the most notorious families ever to rule Rome. So gather your composure, because the next stretch of our path runs through betrayal, ambition, and a series of very carefully prepared cups. It is a grim tale, but a gripping one, and I promise to tell it gently. She turned the vague dread of the age into a genuine trade, with clients, methods, and a reputation, and the emperor she served found her not appalling but useful. Locusta came, by most accounts, from Gaul, the sprawling territory that is now largely France, and she arrived in Rome carrying a deep and specialized knowledge of poisons, the properties of deadly plants, and the grim art of turning them into effective, discreet, and reliable instruments of death. She was, in the plainest terms, a professional poisoner, perhaps the most accomplished the ancient world ever produced, and her skills brought her to the attention of the most dangerous family in Rome. To read her story is to watch a specialist ply a monstrous trade with unsettling competence, and to watch the Roman state reward her for it. Her first great commission, according to the ancient historians, came from Agrippina, the formidable and ruthlessly ambitious wife of the Emperor Claudius. Agrippina wanted her husband dead so that her own son Nero could take the throne, and in the year 54 of the Common Era, Claudius died after eating a dish of mushrooms. The sources tell us that Locusta supplied the poison for the deed slipped into the emperor's food. Claudius, the scholarly, stammering, unexpectedly capable ruler, was gone, and Agrippina's teenage son Nero became emperor of Rome. The poisoner from Gaul had, with a single carefully prepared dish, changed the course of imperial history. It was an audacious debut, and it would not be her last performance. Here is your fact, and it is the darkest and most vivid episode in Locusta's career. Once Nero was emperor, he feared his young stepbrother Britannicus, the natural son of Claudius, as a rival for the throne. So Nero turned to Locusta to eliminate the boy, but the first poison she supplied worked too slowly, merely making Britannicus ill rather than killing him, and the furious young emperor, according to the sources, had Locusta flogged and threatened her, accusing her of giving him a mere medicine instead of a poison. Locusta, thus encouraged, went back to her work and prepared something far stronger and faster, which she is said to have tested first to be sure of its speed. And then came the truly chilling detail of its delivery. At a formal dinner, Britannicus was served a drink that had, as was the custom, been tasted first by a servant to prove it's safe. But the drink was too hot, and so cold water was called for to cool it to a drinkable temperature, and it was in that innocent cup of cold water, added after the tasting, that Locusta's fast-acting poison had been hidden. Britannicus drank, and collapsed almost at once, and died there at the table, while Nero, the sources coldly report, remarked that it was merely one of the boy's epileptic fits and carried on with dinner. It is one of the most horrifying scenes in Roman history, a child murdered at a banquet, by a poison cleverly slipped past the taster through the loophole of the cooling water. Locusta's expertise had turned a simple dinner ritual into a flawless murder. And here is your quirky and deeply disturbing tidbit. Locusta was not punished for these crimes. She was rewarded. Nero, delighted with her deadly services, is said to have granted her a pardon, generous gifts and country estates, and even, remarkably, to have sent her students so that she could teach her poisonous craft to a new generation. Sit with that. The most notorious poisoner in Rome ran what amounted to a school of assassination, with imperial backing funded by the very throne her poisons had helped to secure. She was, in effect, a state-sponsored specialist, her monstrous knowledge treated as a valuable resource to be preserved and passed on. It is one of the most cynical arrangements in all of ancient history, and it tells you volumes about the moral world of Nero's court. Locusta's story has a grim ending, as such stories tend to. Her protection lasted only as long as her protector. When Nero fell and died, and a new emperor named Galba came to power in the chaos that followed, Locusta's imperial shelter vanished. She was arrested, condemned and executed, led through the city and put to death as a criminal at last, her long career of poisoning finally catching up with her, once the emperor who valued it was gone. The woman who had dispatched so many with her hidden cups met her own end at the hands of the state, a fitting, if belated, conclusion to a life, spent dealing in death. Historians still argue about how much of Locusta's story is precisely accurate, and how much has been embroidered by hostile ancient sources eager to blacken the memory of Nero and his circle. The historians who tell us about her, writing somewhat after the events, had every reason to pile up the horrors of Nero's reign, and the figure of the wicked female poisoner was a satisfying villain for a moralizing tale. Some details may be exaggerated, but the core of the story, that a professional poisoner named Locusta served the imperial family, was involved in notorious deaths, and was protected by Nero, is generally accepted as genuine. She was a real woman, with a real and terrible expertise, operating at the very summit of Roman power. Locusta represents the very darkest use of the ancient knowledge of drugs. The pharmacon turned wholly to murder, all its healing potential inverted into pure lethality. But her existence points to something else too, a natural and very human response to the age of poison. In a world where a hidden cup could kill you at any dinner, where even emperors fell to secret drugs, would you not long, above all things, for protection? Would you not dream of some magical antidote, some universal remedy that could render you immune to every poison a Locusta might prepare? One ancient king dreamed exactly that dream, and pursued it with an obsessive, self-experimenting fervour that has become legendary. His name gave us a word, and his quest is where we turn next. His name was Mithridates VI, king of Pontus, a realm on the southern shore of the Black Sea, and he ruled in the 1st century before the Common Era as one of Rome's most stubborn and formidable enemies. But it is not chiefly his wars that we remember tonight. It is his extraordinary, obsessive and slightly mad quest to make himself immune to poison. Mithridates lived in a world and a family where poisoning was a constant danger. His own father, it was said, had been poisoned at a banquet, and the young prince grew up in fear that the same fate awaited him. And so he set out to do something no one had ever seriously attempted. he decided to make his own body into a fortress that no poison could breach. The method he chose was as bold as it was reckless. Mithridates began, according to the ancient accounts, to take small doses of various poisons deliberately and regularly, gradually increasing the amounts, in the belief that by exposing his body to these substances little by little, he could build up a resistance to them. He was attempting, in effect, to immunize himself against murder, dosing himself with the very things he feared day after day in the hope of becoming unkillable by poison. And he did not stop at self-experimentation. He is said to have studied poisons and their antidotes intensively, testing deadly substances and their possible remedies on condemned prisoners, coldly observing which combinations killed and which cures worked, building up a body of knowledge written in the suffering of his captives. Here is your fact. Out of all this grim research, Mithridates is credited with developing a famous compound antidote, a mixture of many ingredients intended to protect against a wide range of poisons, which became known after him as Mithridatium, or the Mithridate. It was said to contain a long list of components, opium among them, along with myrrh, saffron, ginger, cinnamon, and a great many other herbs and substances, dozens in total, all combined into a single protective remedy to be taken regularly as a shield against poisoning. Whether it actually worked in any meaningful way is extremely doubtful, but the idea of it, universal antidote, a single medicine to guard against all poisons, seized the ancient imagination and would not let go for well over 1,000 years. And here is the famous, bitterly ironic ending to the king story, which is your quirky tidbit, though quirky feels like the wrong word for something so darkly poetic. When Mithridates was finally defeated by the Romans and cornered, with no escape left, he is said to have wished to die by his own hand rather than be captured and paraded in. A Roman triumph, and so he took poison. But the poison, according to the legend, would not kill him. His lifetime of careful self-dosing had made him so resistant to poison that he could not, in the end, use it to end his own life. The very immunity he had spent decades building now trapped him in a life he wished to leave. In the most famous version of the tale, he had to ask a loyal soldier to run him through with a sword instead, defeated at last not by poison but by his own terrible success against it. It is one of history's great dark ironies, the man who made himself unpoisonable, unable to poison himself when he most needed to. Historians still argue about how much of the Mithridates legend is true, and how much is romantic embroidery, and in particular whether his self-immunization could possibly have worked as described. For many poisons, the science simply does not support the idea that slowly building up doses would confer real immunity, and for some it would more likely have done him slow harm. The story of the antidote that failed at the end may well be a poetic invention, too neat and too meaningful to be entirely trusted. But the historical Mithridates really was famous in antiquity for his obsession with poisons and antidotes, and the Mithridate really did become a celebrated remedy that outlived him by many centuries. The legend grew from a real seed, however much it flowered in the telling. There is something almost unbearably human in the whole enterprise when you slow down and consider it in the dark. Here was a king with all the power in the world, and what he wanted more than territory or glory was simply to feel safe at his own dinner table. He wanted to eat without fear, to drink without calculation, to stop scanning every face for the flicker of a plot. And so he poisoned himself, gently and deliberately for years, chasing a feeling of safety that may never truly have come. It is a strange and lonely image, the powerful king dosing himself in secret against the people he could not trust. Power, it turns out, did not buy him peace. It only sharpened his fear, and drove him to swallow the very thing he dreaded most over and over in the hope of finally being free of it. What matters for our journey is the idea that Mithridates planted and that the ancient world could not resist, the dream of the universal antidote. His Mithridate, that sprawling compound of opium and myrrh and saffron and dozens of other ingredients, became the ancestor of an even more famous and even more elaborate medicine, one that would be refined and expanded in the imperial court of Rome and would go on to become perhaps the most celebrated wonder drug in the entire history of Western medicine. It would be taken by emperors, praised by the greatest physicians, and manufactured with elaborate ceremony for more than 1,500 years after Mithridates himself was dust. That medicine grew directly out of the king's paranoid quest, expanded and perfected by the doctors of Nero's Rome, and blessed by the pen of Galen himself. the very physician who tended our opium-taking Emperor Marcus Aurelius. It carried opium at its heart, wrapped in dozens of other ingredients, and it promised to cure almost anything and protect against almost everything. It even famously included the flesh of a snake. Its name was theriac, and its strange, extravagant, centuries-spanning story is the next thread in our tapestry. So let the defeated king rest, and let us follow his dream of immunity out of the Black Sea Kingdom and into the glittering, credulous heart of Rome. The dream of the universal antidote planted by the paranoid King Mithridates found its fullest and strangest flowering in the city of Rome, in the court of the Emperor Nero, the very same court where Locusta plied her deadly trade. There, a Greek physician named Andromachus, who served as Nero's personal doctor, took the old Mithridate recipe and improved upon it, or at least expanded it, adding more ingredients and most famously one startling new component. He added the flesh of the viper, the venomous snake itself, to the mixture. The logic in the strange medical thinking of the age was a kind of homeopathic instinct, the notion that the flesh of a poisonous creature might help the body resist poison, that like could somehow guard against like. And so the great compound medicine gained its most memorable ingredient, and a new name. It became theriac, a word connected to the Greek for wild or venomous beasts in honour of the snake at its heart. Theriac was a monster of a medicine, and here is your fact. In the form perfected by Andromachus, it contained something like 64 separate ingredients, a vast and elaborate recipe combining opium, vipers, flesh, myrrh, saffron, cinnamon, and dozens upon dozens of other herbs, spices, gums, and substances, all pounded and blended together with honey into a thick, dark, aromatic paste. It was fabulously complex, fabulously expensive, and fabulously reputed. Theriac was believed to be effective not merely against poisons and snake bites, its original purpose, but against practically every ailment known to humanity, from plague to fever to headache to melancholy. It was the ultimate cure-all, the panacea of the ancient and medieval worlds, and its heart, quietly, was opium, which meant that whatever else it did, it certainly made the patient feel calmer and sleepier and further from their pain. Its greatest champion was the towering figure of Galen, the physician of Marcus Aurelius, whom we have already met. Galen was so impressed by theriac that he wrote entire treatises about it, discussing its preparation, its ingredients, and its virtues in loving detail. And here the threads of our story tie neatly together, because it was theriac, this opium-laden super medicine, that Galen prepared for the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, and that the Emperor took, according to our sources, on a regular basis. So the philosopher-emperor's daily dose of comfort, the mixture that Galen carefully adjusted up and down, was this very theriac, the great-grandchild of Mithridates' paranoid, antidote carrying its measure of the poppy at its core. The king's dream of immunity had become the emperor's daily medicine. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is a testament to the astonishing staying power of a good story. Theriac did not fade with the fall of Rome. It became one of the most enduring and prestigious medicines in the entire Western tradition, manufactured, sold, and prized for more than 1,500 years after Galen. In later centuries, its production became a grand public spectacle. In cities like Venice, the making of theriac was a civic event, carried, out in public with great ceremony, the dozens of exotic ingredients displayed and inspected before being combined, so that everyone could see that the precious medicine was being made properly and not adulterated. Venetian theriac became a famous export, and the medicine was still being sold in various forms right up into relatively modern times. A recipe born of one king's terror of poison became a luxury brand traded across continents for a millennium and a half. Few products in history have enjoyed such a run. Historians still argue about whether theriac ever actually did anything useful, beyond the obvious effects of the opium it contained. As a genuine antidote to poison, or a cure for plague, it was. Almost certainly useless, a triumph of reputation over pharmacology. But it was not entirely inert, because opium is a genuinely powerful drug, and a medicine containing real opium will reliably ease pain, calm anxiety, suppress coughs, and bring sleep, which would have made patients feel considerably better even as their underlying disease ran its course. So theriac may have earned its miraculous reputation on the back of a single genuinely active ingredient, with the other 63 components contributing mainly cost, mystique, and a reassuring complexity. The viper's flesh, one suspects, did very little except make the whole thing sound suitably impressive and dangerous. And perhaps that is the perfect note on which to understand the ancient relationship with drugs, because Theriac captures so much of it at once. It was medicine and mystique tangled together. It was genuine pharmacology in the opium, wrapped in layers of hopeful superstition in the snake, and the saffron and the ceremony. It was a sincere attempt to heal, and a fabulously expensive luxury good, and a comfort that worked partly because people believed in it, and partly because it really did contain something that soothed. It sat at the crossroads of the market, the sick room, the palace, and the temple, exactly where so much of our story has lived tonight. The line between real medicine and hopeful magic ran right through the middle of that dark, honeyed paste. In the end, Theriac endured not because it truly conquered poison or plague, but because it gathered up every hope people had about medicine, the hope for a single thing that would make them safe, and pressed it all into one dark, fragrant spoonful. People wanted that hope badly enough to buy it for 15 centuries. We have travelled now through the gentle world of the poppy and the dark world of poison, through the drinking party, and the surgeon's table and the antidote maker's workshop. But there is a whole other dimension to ancient drug use that we have only brushed against, the use of these substances not to heal, or to harm, but to reach for something beyond ordinary life, to touch the divine, to see visions, to escape the self. For that, we must leave the Greek and Roman heartland behind and ride north, out onto the wild grasslands, to meet a fierce nomadic people and witness a ritual that the historian Herodotus found so strange he could hardly believe his own account of it. Wrap yourself a little tighter, because the wind on the steppe is cold. Ride north now, in your imagination, away from the warm Mediterranean, up onto the vast open grasslands that stretch across what is now Ukraine and southern Russia and Central Asia. This was the land of the Scythians, a fierce nomadic horse-riding people who lived on these steppes in the centuries before the Common Era, and who both fascinated and slightly frightened the settled Greeks to their south. The Greeks regarded the Scythians as the very picture of the wild barbarian, magnificent horsemen and terrifying warriors who lived, without cities, roamed with their herds and followed customs that struck the Greeks as thoroughly exotic. And it is thanks to a single curious Greek that we know one of the most remarkable of those customs. That Greek was Herodotus, often called the father of history, who lived in the 5th century before the Common Era and who wrote a sprawling, gossipy, endlessly entertaining account of the peoples of the known world. Herodotus loved a strange custom, and he collected the habits of foreign nations with the delight of a man who could not quite believe his luck. And when he came to describe the Scythians, he recorded something that has electrified readers ever since, a vivid account of what appears to be the ritual use of cannabis, written down some 2,500 years ago. Here is your fact, drawn straight from his pages. Herodotus describes how the Scythians, after a funeral, would purify and enjoy themselves in a remarkable way. They would set up a small tent-like framework, cover it over with felt cloths to make it as airtight as they could, and place inside it a dish or basin filled with red-hot stones. Then they would take the seeds and parts of the hemp plant which grew in their land and throw them onto the hot stones. The hemp would immediately begin to smoke and smoulder, giving off a thick vapour that filled the enclosed tent, and the Scythians would sit inside in the dense fumes, breathing them in. And Herodotus tells us that they would howl, or shout, with pleasure and delight at the experience, so transported were they by the vapour of the burning hemp. Read that again and marvel, because what Herodotus is describing in the plainest terms is a group of people sitting inside a sealed, felt-covered tent, filling it with cannabis smoke, and thoroughly enjoying the results. It is essentially one of the earliest detailed descriptions of communal cannabis use in all of world literature, set down by a careful Greek observer who clearly found the whole business exotic and a little bewildering. The Scythians had built, in effect, a portable steam room that ran on cannabis instead of water, and they used it after funerals, perhaps as purification, perhaps as mourning, perhaps simply as a way to feel better after burying their dead. Herodotus, to his eternal credit, wrote it all down without fully understanding it, and handed us a priceless window into an ancient world of ritual intoxication. Here is your quirky tidbit, and it is one Herodotus himself could not resist mentioning. He tells us, with a distinct note of Greek disdain, that the Scythians were so taken with this vapour bath that it served them in place of an ordinary water bath, because he claims they never washed their bodies with water at all. To a Greek, for whom bathing was civilization itself, this was a detail almost too shocking to bear, a people who cleaned themselves with cannabis smoke instead of soap and water. Whether the Scythians were really quite as unwashed as Herodotus implies, or whether he was simply enjoying a bit of cultural superiority at their expense, we cannot say. But the image is unforgettable. A whole nation of warriors emerging pink and beaming from their hemp smoke tents, clean in spirit if perhaps not entirely in body. One does rather warm to them. Historians and archaeologists have argued for a long time about how much of Herodotus to believe, because the father of history was also, let us be honest, a magnificent teller of tall tales, and he repeated many stories that were clearly exaggerated or invented. For centuries, some scholars wondered whether the cannabis vapour tent was another of his colourful fictions. But here is the wonderful part, which we will come to properly in a moment. Modern archaeology has now dramatically confirmed the essential truth of what Herodotus described, digging up the very apparatus of these rituals from ancient Scythian burial grounds. The father of history, so often doubted, turned out on this point to be telling something very close to the plain truth. His hemp smoke tent was real. For now, though, simply sit with the scene so different from the marble dinner parties of Greece and Rome, and yet part of the same great human story. Out on the cold, wind-scoured steppe under a huge and empty sky, a fierce people gather in a felt tent around a basin of glowing stones. Someone scatters the hemp. The smoke rises, thick and sweet and heavy, and in the warm, hazy dark, these hardened warriors and horsemen close their eyes, breathe deep and howl softly with pleasure, letting the vapour carry their grief and their weariness away for a while. It is intoxication as ritual, as comfort, as communion, in a form the tidy Greeks found utterly foreign, and we, perhaps, find strangely familiar. There is something in that felt tent that reaches across all the centuries between us and them, a recognition, perhaps, that people everywhere have always looked for some warm and hazy place to lay their grief down for an hour. The Scythians found theirs in the smoke, huddled together against the enormous emptiness of the steppe. The Greeks and Romans knew of hemp too, though they used it rather differently than their wild northern neighbours, and the archaeological confirmation of Herodotus' tale is so striking that it deserves a closer look, along with the other exotic substances that flowed into the ancient world from its distant edges. So let the smoke thin, and let us follow the hemp plant back south, into more familiar and more thoroughly documented hands. Let us follow the hemp plant south then, out of the Scythian smoke tents and into the more familiar world of Greek and Roman medicine, where cannabis had a quieter and more practical life. For the Greeks and Romans knew the hemp plant well, though they did not, on the whole, sit in tents getting joyfully intoxicated on its smoke, the way their northern neighbours did. To the settled peoples of the Mediterranean, hemp was above all a useful crop, grown for its strong fibres, which were twisted into rope and woven into sailcloth, the sturdy cordage that rigged the ships of the ancient world. Every navy in the Mediterranean floated in part on hemp, but the doctors knew it too, and they put it to medicinal use. Here is your fact. Our careful friend Dioscorides, in his great herbal, describes cannabis and its uses as do other ancient medical writers. They recommended the seeds and the juice of the plant for a variety of complaints. Cannabis was used, among other things, as a remedy for earache. The warm juice dripped into a troubled ear, and it was noted for its effect on various pains and inflammations. Some writers observed that consuming the seeds in quantity could dampen certain bodily appetites, and others noted its power to bring on a kind of warmth or, in excess, a clouding of the senses. So the Greeks and Romans clearly understood that hemp was not merely rope, that it had real effects on the body and the mind, and they filed it sensibly among the useful medicinal plants rather than among the tools of ritual ecstasy. Different cultures, the same plant, put to strikingly different purposes. Now here is the truly thrilling part, your quirky tidbit that is really a piece of detective work spanning millennia. For a very long time, Herodotus' account of the Scythian cannabis tents was regarded by many as possibly just another of his colourful exaggerations, a good story that might or might not be true. But then the archaeologists went digging in the frozen burial mounds of the steppe, and what they found was astonishing. In ancient Scythian tombs preserved by the cold, they uncovered the actual apparatus Herodotus had described, small tent frames, braziers and containers of stones, and crucially the charred remains of cannabis. In one famous set of frozen burials, the tools of the smoke ritual lay exactly as the old historian had said they would. And at other sites, stretching as far east as the mountains of western China, researchers found ancient braziers containing residue that chemical analysis identified as cannabis, with a notably high level of its active psychoactive compound apparently burned in funeral rituals. Herodotus, doubted for centuries, was vindicated by the dirt itself. Sit with how remarkable that is. A Greek writer set down a strange story about a distant people 2,500 years ago. For most of the time since, there was no way to check it, and reasonable people suspected it was embroidered. And then, in our own era, scientists pulled the very braziers and the very burned cannabis out of the frozen ground, and the residue in those ancient dishes matched the ancient tale. It is one of the most satisfying confirmations in all of archaeology, a moment where the written word and the physical evidence reached across the ages and shook hands. The father of history earned back a great deal of trust from a handful of charred seeds and some chemical analysis. The wider ancient world, of course, imported all manner of exotic and aromatic substances from its distant edges, and these too shaped the sensory and medicinal life of Greece and Rome. Frankincense and myrrh, those famous fragrant resins, were burned in vast quantities in temples and at funerals, filling sacred spaces with sweet, heavy smoke, and were also used in medicine and, as we have seen, folded into compound remedies like theriac. Saffron, the precious spice drawn from the crocus, was prized both as a flavouring and as a medicine, and was even scattered in perfumed form through theatres and banquet halls to sweeten the air. Wormwood, a bitter herb, was steeped in wine to make a sharp medicinal drink, an ancestor of, much later, bitter spirits. The ancient world was awash in plant substances of every kind, aromatic, medicinal, intoxicating, and sacred, flowing along the trade routes from Arabia and Africa and the East into the markets of the Mediterranean. Historians still argue about exactly how the Greeks and Romans regarded cannabis, and whether recreational or ritual use of it was more widespread among them than the surviving. Sources suggest. The evidence is patchy. The doctors clearly used it medicinally, and the Greeks certainly knew that the Scythians used it for pleasure and ritual. But whether ordinary Greeks and Romans ever sat down to enjoy its intoxicating effects for their own sake is much harder to establish. Some scholars suspect there was more casual use than the prim medical texts let on, while others think the Mediterranean peoples genuinely preferred their wine and their opium and left the hemp smoke to the barbarians of the north. As so often in this story, the honest answer is that we simply do not fully know, and the gaps in the record leave room for a great deal of careful speculation. It is a good reminder that the ancient world was far more connected and far more chemically curious than we sometimes imagine, its markets fragrant with substances gathered from half the known earth. Nothing about these people was simple, and nothing about their appetites was small. What we can say for certain is that these substances, hemp and frankincense and saffron and all the rest, were woven deep into the texture of ancient life, into its medicine, its trade, its rituals, and its pleasures. And nowhere did the sacred and the intoxicating come together more powerfully, or more secretly, than in a set of holy rites performed for nearly 2,000 years at a single sanctuary in Greece, rites whose central mystery may have involved a drink that carried its own hidden chemistry. To that great secret, the most famous mystery of the ancient world, we now at last turn. For nearly 2,000 years, in a sanctuary at Eleusis, a short journey from Athens, the Greeks performed the most famous and most secret religious rites of the entire ancient world, the Eleusinian Mysteries. Year after year, century after century, initiates came to Eleusis to undergo a sacred experience so profound and so strictly secret that revealing what happened at its climax was punishable by death. Emperors were initiated, philosophers were initiated, ordinary Greeks saved and travelled to be initiated, and through all those centuries the central secret was kept so faithfully that, to this day, we cannot say with certainty exactly what the initiates saw or drank or experienced at the very heart of the mystery. It is one of the great locked doors of history. The mysteries were built around the myth of the goddess Demeter, the great mother of the harvest, and her beloved daughter Persephone, who was carried off to the underworld by its dark god, and whose loss plunged the grieving Demeter into a mourning so deep that the earth itself grew barren. Only a bargain that returned Persephone to her mother for part of each year restored life to the fields, giving the world its cycle of seasons, the death of winter and the rebirth of spring. And here is your fact, the thing that made the mysteries so precious to those who underwent them. The initiates at Eleusis came away, our ancient sources tell us again and again, with their fear of death transformed. Having somehow shared in the story of Persephone's descent and return, they believed. They had glimpsed the promise of a better fate beyond the grave, and they no longer feared dying as other people did. Whatever happened in that hall, it sent people home changed, comforted, unafraid. The rites unfolded over days, and much of the outer ceremony we do know. There was a great procession along the sacred road from Athens to Eleusis. There was fasting by the initiates, in imitation of the grieving Demeter, who in the myth refused food and drink, in her sorrow, and there was the breaking of that fast with a special sacred drink, a drink called the kykeon. Here your ears should prick up, because we have met a kykeon before in the Hall of Circe, where it was the vehicle for her transforming drugs. At Eleusis, the sacred kykeon was said to be made of humble things, water, barley, and flavoured with herb, a pennyroyal-like mint. The initiates drank it, breaking their long fast, and then entered the great hall of initiation, the telesterion, where, in darkness and firelight, the culminating secret was revealed. To them, whatever it was, and their lives were changed. Here is your quirky tidbit, which is really one of the boldest and most controversial ideas in the modern study of ancient religion. Some scholars, noting that the initiates drank a special barley brew and then apparently underwent a powerful, vision-like transformative experience, have proposed that the kykeon may have contained a natural hallucinogen, and their leading suspect is ergot, a fungus that grows on grain, including barley, and which contains compounds chemically related to some powerful modern psychedelics. This bold hypothesis, put forward in the 20th century by a group of scholars including a chemist who had himself worked with such compounds, suggested that the great secret at the heart of the mysteries was, in essence, a carefully prepared psychedelic drink, and that the profound visions of the initiates were, at least in part, chemically induced. It is an electrifying idea, and it has been fiercely debated ever since. The great objection to the ergot theory was always that ergot is genuinely poisonous, capable of causing terrible illness, gangrene, and death. So how could the priests of Eleusis have brewed a safe psychedelic drink from it without poisoning their initiates? And here is where recent science has added a fascinating twist. Researchers have shown that it is chemically possible, using methods that would have been available to the ancients, to process ergot in such a way that the dangerous poisonous compounds are removed or reduced while the psychoactive ones remain. In other words, the priestesses of Eleusis, through careful traditional preparation, might indeed have been able to render a parasitic, deadly fungus into a relatively safe, mind-altering brew. It does not prove that they did so, but it removes the strongest objection to the idea that they could have. Historians still argue, and argue passionately, about whether the kykeon was truly psychedelic, or whether the overwhelming experience of the mysteries came entirely from other sources. The fasting, the darkness, the firelight, the sacred drama, the sheer weight of ritual and expectation and communal awe. Many serious scholars are deeply skeptical of the drug theory, pointing out that we have no direct evidence that ergot was in the kykeon, and that a profound religious experience needs no chemical explanation at all, as any student of human ritual knows. Others find the circumstantial case tantalizing, the barley brew, the visions, the transformed initiates, the chemistry that makes it possible. The truth is locked behind that ancient vow of secrecy, and it may stay locked forever. The initiates kept their promise so well that they have kept it even from us, and perhaps there is something fitting in that, as we near the end of our long night's journey. The greatest mystery of the ancient world remains a mystery. We can stand at the threshold of that firelit hall, we can smell the barley drink and hear the fasting, crowds and feel the weight of the sacred dark, but we cannot follow the initiates through the final door. Whatever they found there, whether it rose from a fungus in the cup or from the deepest chambers of the human spirit, they carried it home in silence and laid it down and were no longer afraid to die. There is one last place we must visit before we let the night fully close over us. One final site where the ancient world reached for the divine through a cloud of rising vapour. Not a secret drink this time, but a breath of gas seeping up from a crack in the rock breathed in by a priestess who spoke so everyone believed. with the very voice of a god. Come with me gently now to Delphi, high on the slopes of Mount Parnassus, in a place the Greeks believed to be the very centre of the world, stood the sanctuary of Delphi, home to the most famous oracle in all of antiquity. Here, for many centuries, kings and generals and ordinary people came from across the Greek world to put their questions to the god Apollo and to receive, through his priestess, an answer. The priestess was called the Pythia, and she was the mouthpiece of the god, the woman through whom Apollo himself was believed to speak. To consult the oracle at Delphi was to seek the closest thing the ancient world had to a direct line to the divine, and the Pythia sat at the very end of that line. The ritual was solemn and strange. On the days when the oracle gave its answers, the Pythia would prepare herself, and then take her seat upon a sacred three-legged stool, the tripod, which stood over a cleft or opening in the rock within the innermost chamber of the temple. And there, according to the ancient accounts, she would fall into a trance, an altered state in which she became the vessel of the god, uttering words and sounds that the temple priest would then interpret and shape into the oracle's reply. The answers were famously ambiguous, so cleverly two-edged that they could seem to come true whatever happened, which is either evidence of divine subtlety or, if you are feeling less reverent, evidence of a very well-run business that never quite committed to anything. Here is your fact, and it is the one that ties our whole night together. The ancient sources themselves suggest that the Pythia's trance was induced, at least in part, by a vapour, a sweet-smelling exhalation that was said to rise from the cleft in the rock beneath her tripod. The writer Plutarch, who is an especially valuable witness because he actually served as a priest, at Delphi himself discussed this vapour, this sacred breath rising from the depths, and pondered its nature and its effects. For a long time, modern scholars were sceptical, especially after early excavations failed to find any obvious chasm or gas. But more recent geological investigation has revealed that Delphi sits directly above the intersection of geological faults in rock rich in hydrocarbons, and that gases, including one called ethylene, could indeed have seeped up through fissures beneath the temple. And ethylene, when inhaled, really can produce exactly the kind of trance the ancient sources describe, a state of euphoria, detachment and altered awareness without necessarily clouding the mind into unconsciousness. Picture it then. The Pythia takes her seat above the cleft. From below, unseen, a faint sweet gas rises, pooling in the enclosed chamber, and she breathes it in. Slowly it takes hold, loosening her from ordinary awareness, carrying her into that floating, euphoric, dreamlike state, and from her lips come the words that will send armies to war and settle the fates of cities. A crack in the earth, a breath of gas, and the whole Greek world hanging on what a woman in a trance might murmur. It is our entire story in a single image, the meeting of geology, chemistry, faith, and the deep human hunger to touch something beyond ourselves. Here is your quirky and rather poignant tidbit. Plutarch noted that this sacred work took a real toll on the priestesses. The trance was physically demanding, and he suggested could shorten the Pythia's life, and on rare occasions a session could go badly wrong, leaving the priestess distressed or gravely harmed. Because the role was so taxing, at the height of Delphi's fame more than one woman shared the office, taking turns to bear the burden of the god's voice. There is something quietly moving in that detail, the human cost behind the divine performance, the real women who breathed the strange air of that chamber again and again, year after year, and paid for it with their health. Even the oracle of the gods, it turns out, ran on ordinary human beings doing a genuinely hazardous job. Historians still argue, and vigorously, about whether the gas theory truly explains the Pythia's trance, or whether it is too neat, too eager to reduce a profound religious institution to a simple whiff of chemistry. Skeptics point out that the measured levels of ethylene at the site are low, and that a trance can arise from ritual, fasting, expectation, and belief without any gas at all. Defenders reply that the ancient testimony about the vapour is too consistent to dismiss, and that even small amounts of the right gas in an enclosed space over time could do the work. And so, fittingly, we end our journey exactly where we have stood all night, on the uncertain, fascinating border between the natural and the sacred, the chemical and the spiritual, unable to say for certain which was doing the work, and perhaps missing the point if we insist on choosing. And so, our long night's wandering draws gently to its close. Let your breathing slow now, and let the images soften. Think back over all the far places we have travelled together, and let them blur warm and dim at the edges of your mind. The golden poppy fields nodding in the Mediterranean sun, the lamplit dinner parties, the wine and water mixed in the great bowl, the careful doctor with his little book, weighing out sleep by the grain, the emperor in his tent by the cold river easing into rest, the felt tent full of sweet smoke on the wide steppe, the firelit hall of the mysteries, and the whispered secret no one ever told, and the priestess on her tripod breathing the breath of the earth. They're all asleep now, all of them, these ancient people who longed as we do for comfort, for sleep, for a way to ease their pain and touch their gods. They reach for their poppies and their wine and their sacred smoke, and then, like you, they lay down in the dark and let it all go and rested. So let it all go now too. There is nothing left to do tonight and nowhere else you need to be. The lamps are guttering low. The long road is behind you. Let your shoulders soften and your thoughts drift and your breath grow slow and deep and easy. The ancient world will keep. It has kept for 2,000 years, and it will still be here, patient and quiet whenever you wish to wander back. But not tonight. Tonight there is only the dark and the warmth and the soft weight of sleep settling over you like a gentle hand. Rest now. You have travelled far enough. Sleep well, wherever you are, whatever the hour, and may your dreams be as soft and as painless as the poppy ever promised.